Hello, hello.
Or a star. A dead mic. One in the back of the room. Oh, yeah.
Testing.
Oh.
The host has joined the conference.
Yeah.
That's what I thought she was going to ask. So what's the most unusual?
The Custer County Board of County Commissioners meeting will come to order. Today is August the 5th, 2020. The time is 9 o'clock a.m. I would ask that you join me in a salute to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Madam Clerk to the Board, would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Flower,
Present.
Commissioner Kanda,
Here.
Commissioner Prince,
Present.
Attorney Clint Smith, Admin Assistant Kara Evans, and Clerk to the Board Kelly Camper present.
Thank you very much. Wow. You just never know, do you? We will reserve audience introductions until we get to public comment. And Vern, do you have a record of the number of calls on this morning? He's probably in his other office. Okay, we will postpone the introduction of the folks on the phone until public comment. At that time, if you have something to say, we would ask that you would introduce yourselves. So, amendments to the agenda, gentlemen?
I may have one. It may be handled in commissioner items, but I think we can act on the Piper Sandler engagement letter, and I think it's probably not necessary to have been on the agenda, given that we discussed it and are waiting for the revision.
It's on the August 12th agenda.
Yeah, I know, but we could probably do it earlier than that if we wanted to. It's either way. I'm good with it waiting too. It's not
I'll
going
let
to
the
make a
chairman
difference.
make the call. I don't have a problem either way.
All right, so that's all my
We've already
suggestion.
discussed it. We had some corrections. It appears that they made the corrections. I mean, we could either deal with it now or deal with it then.
Later's
It's not an issue to me.
Other than that, no.
Okay. Yeah, I think just because of the public notice, maybe we ought to wait.
Okay,
I don't know.
I have no issue. We're not
That's the
moving-
only reason. Other than that, I just assume deal with it and get it done. But
Right, and it's not a time-critical thing. In fact, they know they're going to be waiting quite a while. So, yeah, I can concur with that.
Okay.
And I have no amendments, sir.
all right, thank you. Nor do I. Just a second here. Approval of minutes. I don't believe we have any to approve, so we'll move on to commissioner items. Commissioner Kanda, would you like to start?
Sure. Our meeting was yesterday, and there's a couple things that happened. One was we had the Economic Recovery Task Force meet. I know you guys were not there because you couldn't get in, but the internet was working everywhere but in Westcliff and Silvercliff, apparently. And it did come on sometime during the meeting, but nobody joined. So in any case, it was a good meeting. There were about 6 of us there. And a big item there was they wanted to be brought up to speed on the CARES process that we discussed, which Charles was there for part of that when he was here when we discussed it. And then talked about that. And then the fact that we have a new public health director coming on board. Had a discussion and thought it would be a good thing for me to get him in touch with Rick, who's got a briefing that talks about, they did a survey of the valley and the climate of the valley, you know, the personality of the valley and as well as the issues. From their point of view, it'd be a good thing to bring him up to speed when he gets on to talk with him, so we set that up. They're going to come up with a date. And then work the Piper Sandler engagement letter as we just discussed, and we'll wait to discuss that next meeting. So that's all I have for now.
Okay, Commissioner Prince, go ahead. Thank you, sir.
Just a question. Commissioner Canada, do we have another Board of Health meeting other than the 11th, the luncheon?
Yeah, we're going to set up a meeting once we understand when they, if
And I know
and when
that's
they
not a
set
Board of
up
Health meeting.
lift the moratorium on variances, and then we'll discuss that.
Okay. I'll just report it, that I have a rough draft of, it's probably a Board of Health or, I don't know. I'll pass on it. It's okay. I'll bring it up when the time comes.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So I don't have anything.
You know, anything to do with the CVRF is not really Board of Health. It is commissioner stuff.
Is it?
So,
Okay,
yeah,
then
you'd be fine.
I have a rough draft of the CVRF agreement that we've been discussing. I need my
Yeah, that's a good one to bring up.
legal Eagle Beagle wife to proof it, and I'll have it out hopefully later this evening. So I think I made it part generic, but I put in a lot of information that we learned from council yesterday to keep this,
This council.
yes, sir, to keep this on track and not get us in a problem with the sunshine issues.
Good.
That's all I have, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, I sent Charles Bogle an email this morning and told him obviously I was not on the Economic Recovery Task Force call yesterday because of internet problems, but I was up on the north end of the county looking at the fire that seemed to put a lot of people in a state of panic.
Yeah, what did you find? Because I was that curious.
Yeah, it was west of Brush Creek Estates subdivision up in the National Forest, and they were on it with a helicopter with a water bucket. I believe when I got up there, 2-ish, it was probably on its last leg of being put out, because by the time I got back north of town somewhere, I couldn't see any smoke at all. So
I think
I
it is.
appreciate those folks up there letting us know, though apparently there was a little issue trying to get in hold of the fire department, so I don't know what was going on
I
with
think
that.
it was a lightning deal or something else.
I guessed it was lightning strike. There was no roads. I don't think anybody would have been up that high camping. Looked like it was pretty inaccessible. So, and then I also went down and spent a little time at the landfill, looked at the project that's going along. They're definitely getting down into that rock layer that we knew would cause issues, and they were ripping up some boulders, a third of the size of this desk, probably foot and a half thick. Had a couple of them going, but they got those out of there, and still struggling with the whole front end loader situation. So hopefully they can get that taken care of. But nice 632 scraper. So we're making progress there. Then the other thing I wanted to bring up, haven't heard a peep for, I'd say, well over a month, and that would be the Carmel folks. I don't know where we stand with that. Haven't heard a word. So.
That's good. I'm glad you reminded me, because that's another, not meeting, but a telephone conversation I had with both Tim Kunkelman and Carmel because of the same deal. It's time to get from a CenturyLink point of view, them together with what we're doing with the broadband program, and so what they're trying to do is schedule a joint meeting, and you all should get an email soon. He just said they'll send an announcement out, and I think he's looking at the 20th of this month to get the group together that was working that, and he'll send out that announcement.
Now, who's he? Carmel?
Kunkelman's setting it up.
Okay.
Because
We're not paying Kunkelman, we're paying Carmel, and I haven't heard a word
That's
from
what
him.
I just said. Kunkelman is getting Carmel because that's the program that involves the fiber optic teaming with CenturyLink and with our broadband tower. So this is affecting the grant process that CenturyLink has the ability to go after to help support that. So that we'll learn more in that meeting. From Carmel's point of view, he's still working, and we'll get him to give us a program review, and he owes us one from just that program point of view for the fiber program. So, yeah, brought that up, and I had the same question too, Tom. Is we haven't heard much from them since the virus hit, and and they've been working the grant process, which into the next phase of that broadband program is what they're going after. So we'll learn more about that later.
Yeah, I thought we were supposed to be getting weekly reports from
We're supposed
Carmel,
to be
but
at least monthly is what we set up for program reviews, and then when they have issues, they're supposed to be bringing us up to speed, and I haven't gotten anything from them either. So I'll make contact, and we'll set that up.
okay, that's all I have. Upper Ark, I have nothing to report.
Neither here.
Okay, we'll move on. Attorney items?
Nothing since yesterday.
Thank you, sir. Let's see where we're at on the agenda.
I'm waiting with bated
Well,
breath,
again,
sir.
you know, seems like it's all I ever ask is, does the administrative assistant have anything today? Thank you. All right, public comment. Anybody on the phone would like to address the Board of County Commissioners about anything not on the agenda today? Now would be the appropriate time.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Hello. My name is Nita Lynch, and I live in rural Custer County and also Denver, but actually in Custer County way more than in Denver.
That's good.
And I was present at the meeting yesterday and several comments. One, as you all well know, the sound was horrible, and many people who wanted to speak didn't even know we had opportunity to.
Okay,
So,
can I interrupt you for a second, Nita? This is Commissioner
Wait.
Flower.
Yes.
Are you speaking
Yes,
about the BOCC meeting yesterday?
Yes.
Or the Board of Health meeting the day before?
The Board of Health meeting yesterday. I guess it was yesterday. I don't know. I've lost track.
No, it was the day before.
Okay. It was Monday. Okay. Sorry about that. Sorry. Thanks for the
That's okay.
correction.
Yep.
On Monday. So please use Zoom, or there is Google has also the same kind of thing for Meet, because it is really, I mean, even now it's very fuzzy trying to hear people. So that is one comment. A second comment would be a question of, do you all have a parliamentarian, and do you follow Robert's Rules of Order? Because I am not an expert in that by any means, but I have seen a number of times that there'll be two motions on a table, which you can't have, and it seems the level of commission meetings and Board of Health meetings should definitely be following rules of order and have an expert in parliamentary procedure, because I think it might make your life easier and make things move more smoothly. So that's two comments there. Third, I want to ask if there was a group that sent an email with, I think they had 125 signatures on it, to representatives on the Board of Health for Custer County, and I don't believe there was any response back of just acknowledging receipt of that. Not that anyone had to comment, but so my question is, I know that it was sent to each of the commissioners as Board of Health members, so that is a question I have that just involves a yes or no. And then my final is my strong opposition to any kind of even a request for a variance for this rally. And this is not about whether we're a Democrat or Republican, Green Party, Independent, whatever. This is about safety. And for me personally, I wouldn't care what political group was doing this or who was going to show up. And when we look at other candidates across the country, up all the way to the level of some presidential candidates and people who are running for Congress, they are not doing in-person rallies. They're doing Zoom. They're doing the technology that we have. And this is a blatant disregard for the safety of our community. Thirdly, the fact that a draft or whatever it's called was sent up to the State Department of Health without approval of a local group agreeing to send it up is absolutely out of bounds. And so I am asking for a copy of what you all call the draft that was sent to the state board. If you look at protocol, it says that the local board is supposed to first, I guess, look at this and then send it up. It was not. I looked back at the minutes. I was at that meeting also. There was never approval to send anything to the state board. So the process has been totally overlooked, and we have to look at what's the highest good of all. And I want to see some balls from our county commissioners. Thank you very much for the time.
You're welcome. I would respond to some, but I'm going to defer to my fellow commissioners for any comments if you have any. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate your comment about the Zoom. That is in the works. I'm assuming you're aware of that. Our mid-month meeting will be conducted over the Zoom platform. As far as your comments about parliamentary procedure, I'm not going to get in a long, drawn-out discussion about that. The BOCC voted several years back to follow Robert's Rules of Parliamentary Order. I don't know that there's an expert in parliamentary procedure that lives in this county, but I can tell you as a chairman, I strive diligently to adhere to those rules as to the best of my ability. I think that's one of the reasons I'm serving as a chairman. I can tell you there can be more than one motion on the floor, just as your example. So, and then to the email that you mentioned in your comment dated 8/3, that was sent to the 3 commissioners. It was not sent to the Board of Health. It doesn't look like, at least it has BOCC Canada, BOCC Flower, and BOCC J. So I don't know if you've seen that email, but if you did and you took the time to count the people that were listed, they're not signatures, they're just names on there. There happens to be 39 people, not 100 and some. Certainly we have read that, but most of your comments were dealing with matters pertaining to the Board of Health. And so I would highly encourage you to call in at the next Board of Health meeting and voice your concerns there as well. So thank you for your comments. Any other public comment? Go ahead.
Yes.
Commissioner Prince.
Wait,
Hold on just a second. Commissioner Prince, go ahead. Chair recognizes you, sir.
thank you, sir. As to having a copy of a draft plan, I feel is a work in progress, something that is not to be disseminated to the public. I believe once the Board of Health vets the plan, either approves or disapproves it, and makes a decision to send it to the state, then I feel it could be a public document. Just one other thing I want you to know. We had a lengthy discussion about the procedure. I think we are all in agreement now. When I say all, I'm talking about the Board of Health and the county commissioners as to reporting responsibilities, sending stuff to the state, that this needs to be a joint decision, not a single decision. We have voted and approved to ask the state to rescind the proposed plan that went to the state so that the Board of Health then can review the plan and determine what course of action to take beyond that. So, yes, there was a snafu. We discussed it, as we should when something takes place. And to the best of my ability, I am totally satisfied that the procedure is back on track and we're doing well. So I hope that responds to that.
Yeah, and Commissioner Prince, obviously this is a Board of Health matter, so I would appreciate if we can limit the conversation about that. That's why the Board of Health exists, but your point's well taken.
And I agree, but it was discussed at this meeting, so I felt it was appropriate for me to respond at this meeting.
Further public comment?
Yes, this is Joni Liebman.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Regarding parliamentary rules of order, I would suspect that the student council at the high school would be very savvy in how to run a meeting with Robert's Rules of Order, and that if there is no parliamentarian to assist in running meetings such as was held yesterday, which was the Board of Health, I understand.
Okay, let me
I would
correct you, Joan.
recommend that you get someone that could come in and be a parliamentarian.
Joan,
It
let
was
me,
extraordinarily painful to sit for 2.5 hours.
all right,
and
let me
listen to the meeting
let me
yesterday.
interrupt you here, Joan, because you're off the mark. We did not have a Board of Health meeting yesterday. It was a Board of County Commissioner meeting. I thought I just explained that. I'm going to tell.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And excuse me, Mr. Flowers, but is not the Board of County Commissioners also in need of running a parliamentary procedure type meeting?
I'm going to choose my words carefully here. I've got over 30 years experience in teaching parliamentary law. I certainly do not need the high school student council to be coming in here telling us how to run a meeting. If you have a specific issue with parliamentary law at any meeting that I'm the chair of, I certainly would encourage you to stop the proceedings or at least comment when it's appropriate about a specific item. I'm sorry, I'm not going to sit here and listen to people say that they think we need a parliamentarian or the high school to come tell us how to run a meeting. That's not to say that I'm not above being criticized or corrected if I make a parliamentary mistake.
I appreciate
We will
that.
not discuss Board of Health today. The chair will not allow it, so.
I did not intend to be demeaning. I absolutely did not intend to be demeaning, if that's the way it came across. I just think that the 20-plus people that sat in on the meeting yesterday,
Ma'am,
some people...
we did not have 20 people on the meeting yesterday.
It was a Board of Health meeting. I will be quiet. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We did not have 20 people on our call for the Board of County Commissioners meeting yesterday. The chair will not entertain conversation about the Board of Health. That should occur during a Board of Health meeting. Further public comment.
Yes, this is Amanda Schreier.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
I wanted to go ahead and comment. I think there's a lot of folks on this call that are really upset about what happened at the Board of Health meeting on Monday. People waited 2.5 hours, took off work in order to comment, and it was on all sides of the issue. And I think the reason you're getting so much pushback today is because when there was time to comment, you guys hung up on all of us. And so people are really upset about that. And this is the only avenue we have to be able to, talk to you guys about it.
Oh,
So had we been able to comment on Monday, we would have, but we weren't able to, and people are frustrated, and they want to talk to the county commissioners and Board of Health about these issues.
Thank you. You're right, sir, if you want to respond. I caution the commissioners and the public. The chair will not tolerate much more conversation about the Board of Health. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, this is Bill Kanda, and I was running that meeting, and just to be clear, we actually had taken that agenda item, wasn't applicable, and by parliamentary procedure, we took it off for the discussion. However, we gave time at the end of the meeting to allow for comment, and you could have commented then. However, because of the problems we're having with the speakers, I don't know why it's working good today, we asked several times for public comment at the very end of that meeting and waited appropriate length of time, and nobody responded. And then there was a motion made to conclude the meeting, and we adjourned. So there's plenty of time to still comment on that issue, because we're going to bring it up when it's properly appropriate, as Commissioner Prince mentioned, because it will come back as a actual request to put. First of all, it was a plan. It wasn't the variance. It never was a request for the variance. It was a plan for us to consider at some point when the variance issues are raised or lifted at the state level. So we'll hear about it when that's appropriate. Right now, there's a moratorium on no variances are allowed, period. So with that, let's get back to the BOCC meeting. Thank you.
Further public comment. All right, folks, if you're still on the phone, I understand your frustration. Believe me, I don't think there was anybody more frustrated than the 3 Board of Health members. But as the chairman of the BOCC, I think it's critical that I try to enforce the rules of parliamentary law. I would highly encourage you to call into the Board of Health and express your displeasure there. It would be way more appropriate in that platform instead of today. We'll move on. Thank you. I don't. You're the chairman. I'm just a member. I certainly do not have a problem. Exactly. Okay. Staff reports. First staff report this morning is the airport board. Well, looky here. I can't believe it. Good morning. How are you, sir? Bob Jolly,
Flying the flag.
the current manager of the airport board, airport facility. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well.
Good to see you. I'm well, thank you. Better to see you here than when I saw you last, so.
That's true.
Thank you for coming in, both of you. Appreciate it. And for the record, Lynn Legree is also here representing the airport board.
Well, since we haven't been here for a couple of months, I thought I'd bring you up to date a little bit on where we are with fuel. In June, we sold about 700 gallons of fuel. In July, we sold 600. And for the first 3 days of August, we've sold 115.
Wow.
Right now, we have about 850 in the tank, and we got a load of fuel coming this Friday. We did get our second courtesy car out at the airport.
Okay, good.
And we were told that it was the computer that was draining the battery. And since there wasn't much we could do about the computer, we decided to check it anyway, and it ended up being the fog lights, so we just pulled the
bulbs.
pulled the fuse
With the view.
and let the car sit there for about a week and went out and cranked right
I'll
up.
be darned.
So
Wow.
it wasn't a big deal. The T-hangers are just about done. They're starting to hang the doors now.
Good.
And as far as the AWAS goes, the ditch is dug.
Yes.
We're just waiting on the electricians, I guess. I haven't heard anything about when the electricians are going to come to put the PVC in. And
I think
that
Bob
type of-
McDonald's been talking with them, so I know that's in work from what I understood from Bob a couple days ago. Did he talk to you? Yeah. JB Wright's doing it.
Okay. But anyway, that's about it for the airport. It's still there. Oh, we did break a universal joint this morning on the mower, but that's not a big deal to get that fixed.
Yeah, good.
So.
So the ditch, 3,800 feet, 3,900 feet.
Yeah, something like that.
And was that done on a volunteer basis, or did we have to pay for that?
Volunteer.
Wow. Excellent. Yeah, I drove down the other day and smiled when I saw that berm of dirt over halfway down the,
It's all the way down now. It's been
It's
there
all
so
the
long.
way down now. Yeah.
well, it was done then when I went down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's from what you could see from where you were.
I just drove along the highway, saw that berm of dirt all the way down to the segmented circle. So, yeah, I thought, cool. Well, good. Very good. Haven't officially heard anything from Sangre de Cristo. I think that decision was going to be postponed until the next board meeting, I think. Isn't that what I, yeah. I looked this morning, August 26th.
So that's it.
Sweet.
don't mean to bring up an old wound, but has the driveway that the fire truck, is that still in, what, please tell me why this hasn't been done 2 years ago when it occurred. I mean, I'm not blaming you. I'm just, what's
I have no
holding this
idea.
thing up? I mean, this needs to get fixed.
The last I heard, the fire department was working the issue. It's been a long issue, and
So it's been, what, 2 meetings ago, you had the guy that's in charge of
Yeah.
it for the fire
Right, for the fire
department
department.
was there to make the plan, and he was going back, and they were
So
going back and start work and get,
It's
do we
still
have
there.
do we have an estimate on what the cost would be to repair that?
I think they said around
$1,000? Okay.
that was an estimate, but I think when they, was that one just for the concrete, was it?
No, that was for the whole thing.
That was for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And do they have insurance, are you aware of, that would cover this?
They have insurance, but I don't know what they're doing.
Okay, you have insurance.
We have insurance.
Have you thought about making a claim to our insurance and let them go after the fire department themselves?
Talked to Donna Hobby about that, and Donna was going to work the insurance end of it, and I wrote a statement on when it happened, how it happened.
Yeah, right. I know you've been very diligent. I know that. I'm just disturbed that it's still sitting there.
I think after that, and this is what I heard, and we can verify with the fire department, they looked at it, and I think the deductible, they decided to take it themselves rather than have the insurance pay for it, is what I thought.
Well-
So they were going to bring it up at their meeting.
Here's my feeling. Since this has gone on so long, I'm kind of tired of waiting for the fire department to do something. I think, and this is just a discussion item, I think maybe we ought to consider sending it to our insurance company. When they determine that it wasn't our fault, they will then go after the fire department's insurance company. But the bottom line is we get this thing resolved. I mean, we're just creating additional issues with that hole there. So I'm really in favor of putting a fire under this. It seems to me, just because it's been going on so long, the fire department really is not very active in wanting to repair this or fix it. So I would say let's be proactive. Let's go to our insurance company and let's move on down the road and let our insurance company handle it however they see fit.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in parallel, you need to go to the fire department a lot. I mean, go check in with who was that rep? I can't remember. Who? Marty?
Yeah, Marty.
So find out where he's at and tell him. Yeah, they want to spend.
But Marty certainly is not a decision maker.
No,
he was just
he's
there
the guy
as
supposed to be pushing him. So
a voice for the fire department to pass on information. So I guess I've got a couple of questions or comments about this, and I agree that it's gone on longer than it should have. Number one, I thought we did approach our insurance company about that initially and got some pushback that it was not probably going to be covered because it was not our equipment and so on and so forth. The other thing I thought I understood was that the airport board decided to replace more concrete than what was damaged. Is that correct?
You're going to replace the whole ramp.
We're gonna replace we thought we should replace the whole,
Well,
which is just a third of it now, because they've been putting another truck
yes,
on the other side, which has broken.
right. So now, out of the 3 sections, 2 of them are damaged,
Okay,
not just one
okay.
anymore.
So when you say it's just a third now, you mean that the airport board would be responsible for replacing a third of the concrete in front of one bay clear out to the taxiway? Is it a taxiway? And that you believe the fire department is responsible for replacing the other 2 sections of concrete? It would be ridiculous to go to litigation over this, but I agree with Commissioner Prince. I don't know how long the board or the county commissioners should be willing to sit on this thing, and so, and then do you have it in the board's budget to replace a third of that concrete?
I would have to check with the
Okay.
treasurer.
I would guess, and I'm probably maybe speaking out of turn here, but if it's not a budgeted item, then I think that would have to come back to the commissioners for approval to replace that third of that concrete.
Unless you rework your priorities. It's up to you guys. 'Cause
Yeah.
you can move something
That-
out of what you had planned and
Yeah,
budgeted.
and that's why I said
Their
we'd have to
recommendation.
get with our treasurer and find
Right.
out.
Understood,
if we
yeah.
get some extra money
Yeah.
someplace.
My comment was if you don't have
Yeah,
the funds, then I
Yeah,
think that
come
would
back
be
to
a
you.
BOCC decision whether or not to replace that concrete. If you have money in your budget, then obviously you certainly have the wherewithal to make that decision. I'm not questioning that. Anything else, folks?
I have nothing. Thanks for looking into that.
Okay.
Only thing I would add is, on an AWAS point of view, the contract is signed with the guys that are building it, and we've already made payment through the grant to keep
Yes.
that rolling, and the engineering's being paid for. Matter
Yeah.
of fact, I got another bill here that I'll enter into the system,
Yeah.
and the airport board has the matching funds are there, and they've been paying it as, Donna's been working it, the matching grant automatically is taken out of your budget. That's been budgeted, so everything's working like the way it should, is my point.
So do you guys get this bill that Commissioner Canada is referring to?
They get it because I
from-
send it to them.
Yeah,
Okay,
we-
okay, good,
we're copied on it.
okay.
We're
Yeah, they're
aware.
copying.
Yeah.
And they've been
So
copying
your
on it.
treasurer is aware of that, or will be at your next meeting, of course. Yes, sir, Mr.
One
Legree.
thing, we need a little push for Mr. Hyde to,
And good point, I did
Well,
that yesterday.
let him finish, let him finish. I have no idea what he's talking
Yeah,
about.
That's why I'm gonna let him go, but
the taxi lanes, the two new taxi lanes in front of those hangars that are basically gonna be ready to go.
The T hangers? Yes, sir. You're needing grading or?
New grading and our asphalt, which was granted to us first year.
and so I'll comment now, Gary just tried to call me back because they are out on Rosita Road laying down hot mix now, and that was part of the plan is when they have it here, he's gonna make it happen, but we need to find out what he's got to say, because I did after you asked me to, put a fire under him.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Yeah, stay healthy.
Feeling a lot.
And I'll just, for the record, say, and maybe now's as appropriate time as any, Mr. Jolly has submitted his resignation as the airport manager effective August or July 1 or September 1. So I just want to say I can't even begin to guess how many years you've been out there and how many hours you've donated to that cause and to the county and to the airport. But certainly understand we appreciate it and thank you sincerely for all your time and effort.
It's been 9 years.
9 years, my
That's a good
gosh.
point.
Well, in a voluntary
Capacity.
state of mind, for you to do that as a volunteer speaks volumes for you, sir. So thank you very much. I know you're going to be missed.
So
I
we'll
con-
have a
I
hamburger
concur.
fry in your honor. You were thinking about having one going in September sometime, so we'll do it. We'll all go have the Jolly Burgers.
And then I also had to fly in on my calendar. I assume that was canceled. Yeah. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You guys.
Oh, you don't have it? To the custodian? Okay. I will let her know.
At least I'm almost 100% sure. I don't think so. I mean, is she physically here?
Yeah, she's out in the parking lot.
She could try this if you want, but I don't think it's the right one, so.
Thank you.
I'm almost positive that's not, but
Okay.
sorry for the interruption. Trying to get into the public health building this morning, so. Next on the agenda is Human Resource Finance Report. Good morning, Miss Donna. How are you?
Morning.
How's it going?
You want to take the mic?
I think I'm okay. I really,
She can use that. Well.
Just talk loud and
Yeah, we've come down to the point where it's not an option of speaking into the mic or not. because we're tired of getting ripped for not being able, for people not being able to hear. So we'll do the best we can with what we have. Go ahead, ma'am.
Really not much, because with the internet down, I couldn't get my handwrittens done. I couldn't get my handwrittens done.
Yeah, you're going to have to put it right at your, yeah.
That'll be a way to have no one ever sign back on to your meetings. And so my handwrittens are still in process. I did get the CVRF on the website
Okay.
late in the day when it came back. Well, not me, like if I did that, it would be a miracle. Verna put that on for me. Sent it to the Tribune. I was late without being able to send it, so I am running it the 13th and 20th, with the close being the 21st.
Okay, hold on just a second. 13 and the 20th?
Yes,
And close when?
21st.
So if they read that, let's assume they read that for the first time on the 20th, would that be fair to close it on the 21st?
I just did not want to get any further into payroll again on a new hiring. It's just so hard to do payroll
And that's already gone to the paper or not yet? The dates?
it's in the newspaper.
I mean, have you indicated that those are the dates you want it
Yes,
published?
that's on the posting and on the website and in the newspaper posting.
Yeah, I don't want to go down a big, long trail here, but we haven't had this conversation. I just don't know, gentlemen, what do you think? If the last notice comes out on the 20th and we close it on the 21st, is that good business?
But it did go on the website before.
Yes,
I don't-
okay.
So it's been a long, because I even hesitated to put it in on the 20th.
That's where I was kind of heading. Do we need it on the 20th then if we're going to close it the next day? I can tell you as an applicant, I would be highly upset if I read it for the first time on the 20th and then found out
Already
that it
closed.
closed the next day. I'd be screaming at somebody. So maybe we consider, since it has been posted on the website since the 4th, that we just take it out of the 20th. I don't know. It's just a thought.
On the alternative, just for suggestion purposes, maybe close it. How long would you need, when would you want to close it if it didn't interfere with payroll? Would it be like the first or second?
It would be in the mid-month. It would be coming in.
So
on
it'd
the
be the next.
Oh, it would be a whole month
Yeah,
away?
it would be in that middle.
Yep.
I mean, I can do it, but
No,
it's
no,
just,
no, we need to be appropriate. So I would have no problem taking it off on the 20th. It's on the website, and I think, people read the paper. I know Ms. Ballard said she was going to put it in
and I did send it to
the Valley
Tracy as
Beat.
well.
Yeah,
And
so,
so I will tell both of them to pull it.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, I would support that.
I think we'll have a big turnout for it.
Do you?
I do, and I think it'll be,
I do also. It ought to be a great job.
What do you think, Commissioner Kenda?
I agree. Let's do it.
I don't think it's unreasonable. Now, we're not under any statutory requirement to post it for 2 weeks. That was our decision to do that, so I
I
don't,
really had hoped for the 6th and the 13th.
Right.
But it was like 10 to 4.
yeah. So I would support pulling it and just posting it on the 13th then. Gentlemen, by
By
consent?
consent, I
Yes.
would agree.
Okay, good.
And then I did get the interviews set for the OEM candidates.
Will they
Wow.
all be on the 10th?
On
All on the
on
10th.
Monday in the afternoon.
And I will send you the sheet, but
I
I
should
did
do-
finish the last one till about 8:30 or 9 this morning.
I will wait to do my happy dance until we take a recess. I'll actually do it in the bathroom so nobody has to witness it.
I don't want- I
That's
don't wanna
very
hear
cool.
that.
Thank you. I knew that took some work to get that put together, so. And our other two interviewees are good with the the date and the time? Everybody's on board. Thank you. Very cool.
They will start at 1. I left your lunch hour so you could actually have substance before you.
Great
came.
job. Thank you.
Starting at 1. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. That's huge. I'm
on that.
thrilled.
I was
Yeah,
thrilled
that's great.
Because people's cell phones I was having a lot of trouble. I called a lot of times,
Wow.
because even my cell phone had just the tiniest little dot of a bar.
Okay. Well, that's perfect, yeah. So, So I would ask, gentlemen, that maybe, I mean, would it help if we came in a little early and got packets and all that, or, because we can't just show up at 1 o'clock
Right.
and, because we'll have somebody standing in the hallway,
And
so
we want to talk about the process too, a little bit.
would you be available at,
I can send you the questions, I can send you the sheets, I will send you this.
okay?
I can send you the applications. I don't know if it's easier if you look on your computer or if you'd rather have a hard copy to make notes on.
Yeah, I think hard copy might be better.
I would appreciate it. Thank you. I'd like.
I don't know, I know it's a lot of paper, but, I don't know. I said that, but then I think, because I'm always squalling about the amount of paper we use,
I
but,
like to have that so we can highlight stuff. It's easier.
As long
than
as we're
rolling.
recycling the paper, I'm less concerned because I know it's
Yeah.
not going to waste.
It's only
Yeah.
4 applicants.
it's that printer cost that gets me fired up every time I see the vouchers, but, yeah, so I think hard copy would be appropriate. We're down to 4, correct? So I would guess they're not gonna average more than 10 pages per app, as I recall. Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, I really appreciate that. I know you've spent a lot of time on that. One. So I would say, why don't we try to show up at 12:30? And then we can work with Donna to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, if we're gonna, the first interview is at 1. So, yeah, can you reach out to everybody and tell them to be here at 12:30 so we can go through the process of who's gonna ask what order?
So I have 4 of you, so, whew.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'll catch the other 2. And, I've asked each person to come and stay in the hallway.
Okay.
until someone-
Interviewees, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe if you just reach out to the other 2 and say, we'll plan on meeting at 12:30, that'd be great. Thank you. Perfect. Oh, I'm excited about that. I was worried that we were gonna have them strung all over the calendar, so that is huge. Good. Anything else, ma'am?
Nope, that's it.
So handwrittens, you would anticipate those?
I'm gonna go check my mail and see if I got
Okay.
the Black Hills Energy.
Okay.
I don't know if I have the last one.
Okay. So I will be out of the office tomorrow and Friday.
Okay. And then Kelly will
Yep,
stamp you.
that'd be great. Okay, very good. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks
Appreciate
for
it. Oh,
put-
you made
putting
my
that
day.
COVID thing together. Good job.
That's huge. All right, thank you.
Vern has something, sir.
I think I'm next on the agenda.
Treasurer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But that's fine, because, since you're here, we will change the order of those 2. Well, actually, the treasurer submitted her report. She did not want to come in today, so, we have a copy of that. I've got the hard copy here, so, I would move that we approve the treasurer's report.
I'll second it.
Been moved and seconded to approve the treasurer's report. Discussion? Virginia did not specify. I'm just making an assumption here on my own that I believe she chose not to come in because of coronavirus. Further discussion?
Is she on the line by any chance?
I have no idea. You have a question, we can ask her
Well,
to come in.
She
You
ought to
know,
be
there's a
on.
lot of numbers, a lot of columns, a lot of accounts that we follow, more than I truly understand. So I like to ask, just is there any anomalies that need to be brought to our attention? I'll just make the assumption there are none, otherwise she would have brought it to our attention.
That
So,
was my guess, yes.
okay, then I'm fine. No, don't. No, it's
No,
fine.
and let me see when she sent us the.
This morning.
I can't.
I got it this
Oh, you
morning.
did? Okay.
I haven't really looked at it, but to be honest with you, a lot of this, you just walk by, a lot of it is, you know, I get it, but I just don't know in relationship to last month, the month before, are we up to speed? Is we any anomalies, that kind of thing. So it's fine. If she would have brought it to our attention, I'm not an issue.
Okay. Further discussion?
I'm fine with it.
Hearing no further discussion, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor of approving the treasurer's report, say aye. Commissioner Flower, aye. Commissioner Kanda,
Aye.
Commissioner Prince.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you, sir. To Kelly, sorry. All right, next item on the agenda is the IT report. Good morning,
all.
sir. Welcome. Thank you for coming in. We appreciate that.
Do you want me to be up there or?
No, you're fine right there unless.
Good
yeah.
morning. I don't have a lot to report on IT. We're moving forward with the, we purchased those computers for the MRC folks, got them all set up. My assistant and I, Alex, are working on integrating the microphones and everything into the conference system so that we can have better sound quality. And of course, implementing the Zoom system as well. By the end of this month, actually, also Alex, my assistant, will be moving on to other pastures. So I'll be flying solo for a while till we figure out what's going on there. That's all I personally have. Yes, sir.
Comment then, would you ask Mr. Anderson if he could give us a resignation in writing so we can move forward?
Absolutely,
Thank
yes.
you.
Yes, sir.
Just in relation to what we're just discussing, do you feel that it's a position that is critical to the county, needs to be filled, or is that a position that we can take a wait and see attitude?
Right now, I think a wait and see. We've worked on a lot of projects. We've brought a lot of things up to date over the last 8 months that Alex has been working with me. So, and we've got the new website, and we've created a lot of better systems than we had in the past. So we may be able to do without for a while. We will see over this month. We'll sit down and we'll work on an outline for the future.
Sure, perfectly reasonable. Thank you.
Okay. Also, I wanted to report as deputy coroner work, we did get the new pickup truck that Cindy Howard started many years ago, and then Meredith finished, and then it culminated this last week. We have a new pickup truck. It's a big 2500 for the coroner, of which the county only actually has to pay about $12,000. So it's pretty nice.
I got a tour of it yesterday. I should have mentioned it because Art is grinning from ear to ear, and he's got the outfitter, the company that outfitted it, did a great job. The bed and the cover and the equipment and the way it's set up, really nice. It's a good truck.
So I asked Art if I could go for a ride, and he asked me if I was going to be in the front seat or the back.
I didn't want to ride personally.
Yeah, we also looked at that vehicle the day before yesterday too. They did a good job. ARE is a great company, and they time we get it decaled out and lit up and all that, it should be a great asset to the county, bought and paid for. There was no lease involved. This was an outright cash payment.
Yes, indeed. It's and like I said, it was a 75% matching grant from FEMA, so we're in a good place with it.
Great. Good job.
Yeah, and thank you for the work you did to finalize all the paperwork and the title work. Obviously, you mentioned it. I'll just reiterate. Cindy Howard had put a lot of effort into that. Meredith had a lot of follow-up effort too. So, commend both of those folks for their efforts on our behalf.
Will do.
Good. Anything else, sir?
Is there anything else for me?
Quick question. I know I spoke to you about trying to price out some Chromebooks. Did you get a sense of delivery time? I was told the other day probably 8 weeks. Did you have any conversations about that?
Depending on where we source them from, if we don't source them from the same place, we'll probably get them a little bit faster than that.
Okay.
Probably 4 weeks or so.
All right, sir. Thank you. Everything else going okay?
Everything's well.
Good. Good. Any other questions, gentlemen? I wonder, maybe the attorney might have a question for you. I don't know.
Cat's doing wonderful. And the new one we're probably getting this weekend. Yep.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming in. You can probably push the door back open now, I would think. Hopefully we can anyway. All right, that concludes our staff reports. Unfinished business, gentlemen, that I'm not aware of?
I have not, sir.
Commissioner Kanda?
None here.
Nor do I. New business? Yes, sir, go ahead.
Can I request a few-minute break?
You may. Without objection, the board will be in recess for 5 minutes.
It's skinnier over there.
BOCC meeting will come to order. Yeah, well, let me just say this about that. One tap of the gavel signifies that a meeting comes to order. I'm sorry, one tap of the gavel signifies to be seated or that an action has been completed. Two taps of the gavel calls a meeting to order. No, sir. Brought that information with me from home. We'll move on to new business. Public comment will be allowed on each item prior to the BOCC taking a vote. No, he's not. The first item of business is Board of Equalization. State statute requires that before the end of August the 5th each year, the BOCC needs to function as the Board of Equalization to hear a report. So with that, I am going to recess the Board of County Commissioners meeting, and I will call to order the Board of Equalization meeting. Clerk to the board, well, actually, I'm not calling on you as clerk to the board. I'm calling on you as a clerk and recorder. Do you have a report for Board of Equalization?
All I have is that neither JD or myself received any BOE request.
Okay, and I'll explain a little bit as we go here. Pardon me. So Board of Equalization sits to hear any appeals that citizens may have stemming from tax property assessment. As the county clerk has indicated, she has not received any, and nor has JD, the county assessor. So I do not believe, gentlemen, unless you have something else, that there is no action to be taken as a Board of Equalization.
I concur, sir. Without people asking for variances in their tax assessment, we have no action to take.
The only other, maybe to make public, is we meet more than once a year if there's a requirement to. So it's not like if you miss it, you're out of luck.
Anything else? Hearing none, then I want the record to show and reflect that there were no appeals to be dealt with from the Board of Equalization. Therefore, the Board of Equalization meeting is adjourned. So we will reconvene the Board of County Commissioners meeting. The next item of business is to review the draft of the 2019 financial audits for the county. Is Mr. DiNardo in the hallway? I cannot see. Okay, so we'll wait just a second. And then,
A little early, I think.
and that's a great point, Commissioner Kanda. I actually don't know what the statutes say, how often the BOE can meet, or if they only review those one time.
Once a year.
That's what I was thinking. It just has to be done
Yeah.
before the end of the business day on August the 5th.
Citizens can contest his taxes at any time. I guess maybe they stack up to the end of the year. I always thought you could make an appeal.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about is it once a year that we have to do this, or 2 years?
By statute, once a year, annually.
Oh, it is. Okay.
You have to do it at least once a year. But I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe you have to wait till
At least that's what I understood from JD. I'll follow up on that, though, because I really don't know.
Because
You would think someone could appeal to JD. Now, whether JD brings those appeals to the BOE more than once a year or not, I don't know that.
They appeal to JD all the time, and he gets it resolved in his office. It's if they can't resolve it, then it comes to the BOE.
It's really kind of a second appeal by the time it gets to the BOE.
sort of like a appeals court.
Okay. So we are currently waiting for the auditor. He is bringing hard copies of the 2019. He is bringing hard copies of the 2019 draft audit. This is a draft. It is not the final. So I think we'll stand in recess, gentlemen, unless you have something else until he gets here.
That's fine.
Okay, we'll go back into recess and wait for the auditor. Thank you. Okay. The BOCC meeting will reconvene. Our next agenda item is reviewing the draft of the 2019 financial audit for the county. Mr. Sam DiNardo presenting. So good morning, sir, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you. I've got plenty of room.
Okay.
You can raise that chair up if you're more comfortable.
I'm okay. I just need to just
Yeah, take your time.
get the papers in
We are
order
in
here a
great
little
shape.
bit.
No big hurry.
Okay.
And for the record, Sam, if you don't mind, are you representing yourself or are you representing a company today?
I'm representing our firm, Garen, Ross and DiNardo,
Thank you.
and of course, here to review the audit report with you.
Okay.
And if you guys are ready, I'm ready.
Okay. Yes. Mr. Sam?
She can have mine, she's the one that needs it.
I have a donor copy.
Oh,
I didn't see you back there.
she snuck in. I actually didn't see her walk in either, so.
Snuck in.
Sam, if you don't mind, I just want to ask, how many years have you audited the county's books?
Well, our firm has been doing it for decades, literally.
Okay.
I've been
Different
working
folks.
with different
Yeah.
people. I've been primarily responsible for a little over 20 years.
Wow, okay. Certainly familiar with the processes of the county.
I think so, yeah.
Maybe more than you want. Good, thank you, I appreciate that. Okay, sir, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I'll do my best to do the mask and everything.
Yep.
If you can't understand what I'm saying, just let me know and I'll try again. You kind of know a little bit about my style. What I think we have time to review this morning is kind of an overview. As you can see, this is a pretty lengthy document, some 40 plus pages. So not really time for us to go through each of them in detail, but there's some important aspects of it that I want to be sure we discuss with you and convey that information, and just make a few remarks as we go.
Okay.
You'll notice tucked inside the front there was another letter that was loose, not part of the bound report. That's the management letter, and my intention is, and I think as we progress through the report, I'll make some remarks that will basically address the things in the management letter. If we miss anything or if there's questions along the way, we can, of course, discuss those.
Okay.
The first thing of note to point out to you is, you might recall from last year, we had federal funding in excess of the levels required. So we had to apply single audit procedures to the county's financials that require some compliance-related testing and some additional reports. And we've kind of been on the bubble there for a little while. The bubble meaning the threshold is $750,000 in federal revenues or expenditures. So if we exceed that level, we have to apply those single audit requirements to the engagements. If we're below that level, then we don't have to do it. So for 2019, the report we're about to look at, we did not have to do that. We fell below those levels by about 100,000. We had about 653,000 as I recall. So some of the reports, if you were go back to 2018's, we didn't forget to do. The single audit reports are simply not required for this year. In years where we exceed those levels, then obviously we apply those procedures and all the requisite reports have to be prepared. Just for the record, if you look through here and study it in some detail, and tallied up everything that was identified as federal sources, you would see that it does exceed 750,000. But just understand or remember that we have a couple of federal funding sources that are not subject to that threshold.
Okay.
The most significant one in our case is the PILT monies.
Right.
So even though it's federal source funds, it does not account against that $750,000 threshold. So with that said, we'll just kind of get into this, and I'll try to point out the things I think are of some note and respond to your questions when you have them.
Okay, we can ask as we go.
If you'd like,
Okay.
I'm fine with that.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Pages 1 and 2 are the independent auditor's report. And so without taking a whole lot of time here, I'm just going to say that it's what we refer to as unmodified. We used to call it unqualified.
Right.
I changed the lingo just a little bit.
Okay.
And that's a good thing. In layman's terms, what that essentially means is the financial statements as they're presented here, we think, fairly present financial position and results of your operation.
And if you didn't, then you would modify.
If there was a need to modify, a departure from GAAP or some other modification, such as certain conditions of financial distress, compliance-related matters that were serious enough, it could elevate to a modification.
Okay.
We don't have any of those.
Right, thank you.
That's followed by what we call the, conveniently, MD&A. It's really management's discussion and analysis. And those pages are identified in lowercase Roman numerals from 1 through 7, I believe. And this is kind of a condensed version of some financial highlights. What it does is provide some narrative information about the county's finances and some condensed financial statement tables. Those financial statement tables are drawn from the basic financial statements, but they're in an abbreviated format. And the concept here is for a person that didn't have the interest or the time to study this big report, they could read these several pages and get some notion of what the county does, where our funding sources primarily come from, what we spend our money on, and in some cases maybe some sense of our relative financial position, whether it's improving or deteriorating. Since the financial data here is drawn from the basic financial statements, I intended to pretty much skip that MD&A and
Okay.
get to a little bit more of the meat of the report. And the first of those is on page 3, entitled Statement of Net Position. And it's followed, obviously, by page 4, and a statement identified as Statement of Activity. So here's a couple things to understand about these two pages. This is where we sort of combine all the activities of the county into single financial statements. So in other words, it's not sorted out as you're accustomed to seeing your internal reports by general fund, road and bridge, and you know, all the other different special revenue funds and activities that we account for. They're all combined, number one. And the second thing is, you'll notice here that we recognize long-term assets and liabilities as well that are not reflected on the balance sheets of the governmental funds. So this is unlike anything you see or are required to produce as a part of your internal accounting. It's obviously GAAP required, but kind of designed to address needs and interests of other statement users, people and organizations such as credit agencies, lending institutions, and bond underwriters, and that kind of thing. So for that reason, it's kind of important to just understand a little bit of what is included here. Obviously, we have current assets dominated by cash and receivables. Same things we would see for the most part in the governmental fund statements. The couple things that are blended into the assets that would not appear on those statements are prepaid expenses, which is just what it says. You know, something paid in advance or unexpired insurance premiums, things of that nature. And then...
Can I ask you a question, sir? I'm sorry to interrupt. And it's a little off topic, but since we're on the current assets. How would the commissioners, the BOCC, handle a cash on hand? I'm sure you're not thrilled about this term, but I'll get right to it. A petty cash drawer for the commissioners to buy water for meetings or stuff like that. How would we go about doing that if we wanted to keep $500 in cash on hand for our administrative assistant to use?
Well, you certainly could do that. Any reason that you couldn't? It would be handled as any other, we call it impressed petty cash fund.
Okay.
So, you know, our controls would be, you know, who has access and when and for what purposes. And then you essentially replenish that fund by reimbursing receipts for expenditures that have been properly authorized to have been spent from there.
Okay.
So that would require receipts and kind of an accounting. You might think of it in terms of an expense report.
Okay. So if I'm just supposing, let's say we had a $1,000 petty cash fund that the administrative assistant kind of kept track of and dealt with those receipts. Then I guess I'm kind of wondering then, how do we report that back to Donna?
Well, the first thing would be allocating cash to it, which would come from the treasurer's office to begin with. And then the accounting through Donna's office would come in the form of the replenishment.
Okay.
Okay, so if we consume some of those funds for these expenses, and let's say we had 500 in there and we used $400 for expenses of some sort or another, then we would replenish that by turning in an expense report with the appropriate receipts attached, and you'd process a voucher just like you would anything else.
Okay.
To replenish that fund, and it would be at that point where that reimbursement, if you will, is recorded, that the expenses would be recognized in your general ledger.
Okay. Okay. So, just for example, so we want to buy coffee for our meetings. We could use that petty cash, turn that receipt in. Does that have to be done on a monthly basis or annually, or when it needs to be replenished, or are there any guidelines for that?
When it needs to be replenished is the practice I see most often. And there really isn't any guidelines other than maybe your good judgment in terms of how long you should go before turning in those receipts. And so
Okay.
if you don't use it very often, you don't have to turn it in very
Right.
often.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sir, going back to the actual report, I'm looking on page 3. Is there somewhere in the document, because I haven't had a chance to go through it, of course, that compares the December 31st, 2018 with 27? I see cash on hand, on assets, liabilities, but I'd like to compare that with how that looked a year ago.
That's a yes and a no.
Okay, well, I'll take that as a maybe.
Yeah, it's somewhere in between. Let me kind of explain a little bit.
And I don't mean to jump ahead. I was just thinking
that's
these are interesting
perfectly
numbers, but I don't know, they don't mean a lot unless they compare.
These are typically not presented in this part of the financial statement on a fully comparative basis.
Got it.
Just because of the space and kind of difficulty in configuring all the numbers in a way that's concise yet informative. So there really isn't a real handy way to do it. Now, there is a little bit of comparative information included in the MD&A. And so, for example, on page 3 of the MD&A, this is the lowercase numerals, the ones I sort of skipped over a moment ago.
Yeah, I see the
It does give
comparison.
us totals. You can see that there's not enough detail on this table, to see all the line items necessarily, if we wanted to isolate, for example, just cash or receivables and so on.
I think this really answers my question. I glossed over this again, but looks to me like our net position increased by about $800,000 over the prior year.
You're exactly right.
Okay, great.
You're
That's what I was concerned about. I want to know if we're going up, down, or staying the same.
Right.
And,
So here's the same document from 2018, and of course it corresponded
Of
right
course you could-
800,000.
Thank
you
you.
could do that. There is another way to
This-
tell if you just want to know, what the net change was. And that's on the page 4. It's a statement of activities. And to get it all on one page, we gotta, turn it sideways here, but you can see we group our activities into some broad functional categories, and we start with expenses. Actually reduce it as we work across the document from left to right. Reduce it by revenue sources that are just broadly considered program revenue, so charges for services, grants and contributions. And in the column not furthest to the right that says E911, but right before that, under the governmental activities, you'll see a series of those totals in brackets, the sum of which is the negative $4,445,677. And right below that, we identify general revenues that are used to support all those functions. Most importantly, obviously, are tax-related revenues, but there's a few other things in there, such as asset sales and so on. And the sum of those revenues, then, we can see exceeds the shortfall, if you will, in the various governmental activities. So that line that says changes in net position is $834,092. Everybody spots
Yes.
that, hopefully?
Yep, following it very
That's as
clearly.
close as we come to saying this is your net profit for the year. Okay, so that's a positive number, meaning that our net equity measured on this basis has increased. So I didn't jot down all the comparative totals, but I did make note of what that change was for 2018. And we had an increase in 18 of 158,581. So a little increase.
Okay.
Just a couple things. On page 3, just so you're aware, the non-current assets is pretty much all of what we think of as a tangible property that's owned by the county. So that's land, buildings, equipment, office furniture, fixtures, computers. We do use a capitalization threshold, however, and for the last several years we've used a threshold of $1,000. So if we have items that we purchase where the per unit cost is below $1,000, it's not included here, but anything that reaches that threshold or above certainly is.
So how's that value established?
It's our cost basis. It's what we originally spent to either acquire or construct those assets.
And you deduct it or appreciate it.
And we depreciate it. And the depreciation protocols that we use are, there's no reason to make it any more complicated in our setting here than straight line
Good.
depreciation. So
Sweet.
straight line depreciation.
Okay.
And the useful lives that we use are not like what you would find in a commercial business that, oftentimes follows tax protocols. We generally follow guidelines that are produced by the GFOA, Government Finance Accounting Officers Association, that has done decades worth of study on service lives of the assets that are commonly found in governments. So that's kind of how that's determined. But you are correct. We do have an element of depreciation on all of our assets other than land, which is still considered not depreciable.
So a building, is it possible to depreciate it clear to zero, or did it always have a value even after that?
It is possible to depreciate it clear to zero. So a newly constructed, let's just say something in today's dollars, that would be newly constructed or purchased, we would commonly use a life of 40 to years or more, 40 to 50 years. So yeah, over 40 years, we would depreciate it to zero.
The only way you can get above that is to do a remodel or an addition to it, and then you start
We
again. Or how
we would capture the costs of any additions, remodeling, refurbishments.
But the value of the building, for all purposes, for this, would be zero, even though that you could sell it for X for a department store.
Is exactly right. It has no relationship to the current market value of the asset. None whatsoever.
Strictly the life of the facility.
Right. And
So it'd be like a savings account that's not accruing any interest, or it could be.
yeah, I suppose you could look at it. There's value there,
There's value
certainly.
to it.
Yeah, there's certainly value.
Okay.
But you can think of depreciation as a cost recovery mechanism, not necessarily any effort to correlate the carrying value to the current market value of those assets.
Thanks.
Current liabilities, we pretty much recognize in our governmental fund financial statements, with the exception of the capital lease total. And in non-current liabilities, they're recognized only in this statement of net position. So you can see landfill closure costs, capital leases, the non-current portion, and compensated absences. So just a couple notes on that. Capital leases, to get the total amount outstanding, we combine the current and long-term portion, so 182,000 plus the 610. So 792,000, just shy of 800,000 in outstanding principal and capital leases at the end of last year.
And I'm just struggling on the 182,000.
That's the last line before you see the subtotal for total current liabilities. Do you find that?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was up one line. I kept looking at unearned revenue, sorry. Capital lease is 182, thank you.
Right. So capital leases, just under 800,000 outstanding. Landfill closure costs is the landfill we are currently and have been operating for about 20 years or so. And where that number comes from is it's the engineer's report on the closure costs and the post-closure costs for the 30-year requirement to maintain that cover. And then we take those numbers applied by an estimate of the amount of landfill area that has been consumed. So that's how that number is derived and where it comes from. And compensated absences is an estimate of the total amount of accumulated leave that county employees have earned but not used at the end of 2019.
Right.
And that's, number of hours limited to our policy restrictions times current pay rates, essentially.
And that money has to be held, quote unquote, in escrow. I mean, we have to have that money available,
No.
or we just need to be aware of
There
the
is no
liability.
escrow
Okay,
requirement for
okay.
that, no.
We gotta have enough to pay for it eventually.
But essentially, we gotta pay for it. I mean, we pay for it in two ways. One is people simply use their leave. They take vacations and so on. And the other, sometimes people leave the employment of the county and have unpaid leave. We have to pay them for it.
So the total liability the county would have to stand is at 238.
As of the end of
Right.
last year, yes.
Thank you.
And then net position we used to call fund balance. We changed the lingo, and you can see we changed the categories a little bit. So invested in capital assets, net of related debt, is essentially the capital assets line, $5,491,374, less any current outstanding debt to acquire those assets. And in our case, the capital leases are almost exclusively used for equipment purchases, and so that's subtracted from that total. Temporarily restricted, for the most part, would relate to grant monies that we've received but yet not fully expended, and the residual balances, at least for the most part, in special revenue funds. Special revenue funds are pretty much all of your funds with the exception of the general fund. That's what we're talking about there. Restricted for emergency is what we would commonly call, and probably amongst ourselves, call the Tabor Reserve. So that's the 3% reserve requirement. 3% of our current non-exempt spending is what it relates to. And unrestricted means it's kind of what's left over, not subject to some reservation or restricted reserve requirement. We kind of covered page 4.
So what kind of an emergency causes it to be restricted?
Well, that reserve requirement is in our statutes. Yeah, it's actually was an amendment to our Constitution in 1992.
And what did they expect to use it for?
There's
Anything?
defined, no. Good question.
Got a broken truck.
That's not considered an emergency. Have cash flow problems, that's not considered an emergency. They're generally talking about things that might happen that are beyond our control, such as expenditures related to natural disasters.
Right.
Fire, floods,
Snow.
that kind of thing. For the most part, we think of that as sort of not available, because if we use it for one of those qualifying emergencies, we got to put it back in the ensuing fiscal year.
So if the roof
So-
blew off the
You always
courthouse,
have to carry that minimum balance.
Pretty much. That's
You can use
exactly
it,
true.
but you gotta figure out
You
where it's
can
coming
use it
from
for
next.
one of those specified reasons, but then it must be replenished.
and it's 3% of the,
I use the term non-exempt spending, so here's what I really mean by that. We take the total expenditures of the county by fund, but we realize that some of those expenditures are made with sources of funds that are not subject to this reserve requirement. And the most significant in our case would be federal funds.
yeah.
So all the money we receive from federal funding sources, in this case including TILT, is not subject to this reserve requirement. We have a few others too. All the money coming into the CTF, I'm sorry, this slips once.
Yeah,
They're really
I'm
hard to
talking.
keep in.
Lottery money going into CTF fund
Right.
is not required to be reserved for insurance proceeds. For example, we had a sheriff's vehicle that got
Right.
totaled and we got insurance money on that. That doesn't have to be included.
Okay.
Proceeds from the sale of county assets doesn't have to be included. So if we sell property, equipment, something like that, also not subject to a reserve requirement. And then we don't really have too much of that here, but it is possible to have certain voter-approved funding sources that might be able to be. They're typically subject to the 3% reserve requirement, even though they're not subject to the excess revenue.
Tourism money from,
That is subject to the reserve
It
requirement.
is?
It is.
wow.
It is. So we have some. So when I use the term non-exempt spending, that just means some of these things we don't have to reserve for, and I subtract those out before we apply the 3%.
Thank you.
Okay, if we skip forward just a little bit to page 5. Now we see things that are a little more familiar to you, sorted out in the fund categories that you're accustomed to seeing in your own financial statements, and that we budget for, and all that kind of thing. So we'll just kind of go through that real quickly. Of course, the most significant, largest of those is the general fund. That's the first column. Page 5 is the balance sheet. For those of you that want to skip just a little bit, the revenues and expenditures are on page 7. So we'll kind of go back and forth just a bit. At any rate, general fund, you can see here we don't have the long-term assets and liabilities I was mentioning a few moments ago. It's current assets and liabilities. So in our case, it's cash and receivables that comprise all our assets, and liabilities are only current liabilities. So basically processing of accounts payable and warrants payable that were outstanding at the end of 2019. You see one other item there called deferred inflow property taxes, $1,142,000, and that is essentially an estimate of the property tax collections for 2020 that will be generated by the mill levy you certified at the end of 2019. So it is included in the taxes receivable number and the assets, but the property tax revenue that we won't collect until 2020 is in this category we call deferred inflow. And that applies to all the funds for which we have certified a mill levy. So that same thing we'll see throughout. Now we have fund balances rather than net position, as we saw in the governmental or the government-wide financial statement. And here we label the equity section a little bit differently. So I'm just going to talk about those broad categories. Non-spendable means things that are not in a form that we can appropriate additional spending. So the obvious thing here is inventories. We have inventories that we carry in the road and bridge department. Of course, we use that for road and bridge activities, maintenance, repairs, and so on. But we really can't appropriate that for additional spending as it's not a financial resource per se. And then we have restricted. When we use this term in this section, what we mean is it's restricted by some external requirement, either a grant, contract, provision in the statute, or something of that nature. In the general fund, when we have restricted funds, we're almost always dealing with funding sources, federal funds, and other grants that have spending requirements. So we satisfy those requirements simply by using those resources for their intended purpose. And then, even though we don't have anything in this category, I'm going to make a comment about committed fund balance. Committed fund balance is at the discretion of our governing boards. In our case, our Board of Commissioners could identify some element of fund equity to be committed for a particular purpose. It's basically identifying some element of your equity that you wanted to use for a particular purpose. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the current year, or could be something we provide for over a period of years.
Okay, just a quick question.
Yes, sir.
You don't have anything there.
Yeah.
And we
don't have anything.
We have tried to designate certain income toward the justice center.
Right.
How does that show up?
Well, I'll tell you where that shows up is because most of what we have dedicated for that purpose is in the capital improvement fund, and that's restricted.
Okay.
Okay? So
It doesn't committed make it restricted.
no, it does not.
You can move it
Committed
around
doesn't make it restricted because it's at the discretion of our
Right,
governing
we
board.
could decide to do that.
So either our board here or some future board could change that commitment if, in their judgment,
The
it
future board
needed
could do
to
it
be
on a restricted fund.
No. You can't, restricted means an external requirement imposed on the use of those monies. Not something we designate or commit, in this case, ourselves. So, external requirements we would encounter would be almost any grant funding has purpose-related restrictions. We apply for a grant to use for a certain purpose typically. So that's always restricted. anything that's restricted by statute. And most of the equity in our, we call them special revenue funds, which is pretty much all our other funds except for the general fund. The reason most of that is restricted is those funds were created to account for resources to be applied to specific functions. So let's take, for example, Road and Bridge in the very next column. Virtually all of the money going into Road and Bridge is tax-related revenue. It's either our ad valorem tax from the property tax or, as you know, highway users tax. Statute requires that we use that for road and bridge activities. Now, what specific road and bridge activities we use it for is up to, Road and Bridge administration and all of you, our governing board. But we don't have the ability, for example, to say, well, Road and Bridge has enough money for now, so we think we'll take and put it somewhere else.
Right.
You can't do that.
Right.
Yeah, and that pretty much is true of all the special revenue funds. So that's why most of the equity you see associated with those funds, Road and Bridge, Human Services Fund, we now call it, we changed the label on that, capital improvement, all is restricted. So I agree with you that we have committed in our, in our thinking, our budgeting, certain resources to help provide for the spending on this judicial center. But really, the fact that it's restricted sort of trumps that notion, if that makes any sense. Okay? The reason I left committed in there, even though there's nothing there, is actually not for us. It's for the state auditor. Because I want him to know that, we specifically don't have any. So, assigned fund balance, you can see exists only in that column that says other governmental funds. And so let me explain. The funds that have a column unto themselves, the general fund and the largest of our special revenue funds, those are called major special revenue funds. And they're called major because they satisfy a mathematical test based on the amount of assets, liabilities, revenue, or expenditure. So they exceed that test, then they have to be considered major, just meaning they're presented in a column by themselves. Those that are below that threshold are included in a total that says other governmental funds. And so really what that comprises in our case is 5 different funds that we use. In our case, the contingent fund, the CTF, EMS, airport, and our tourism and lodging, those 5 activities. So if we want to see, I'm trying not to make you skip around too much in the report, but if we want to see the detail for those funds, that starts on page 33. And then we would see a columnar approach, just like the one we're looking at here on page 5, that's for each fund.
Yeah, I was wondering about
Find
EMS,
that.
where
Yeah,
that
so
was gonna
here's
show
where
up.
we would go if we want to see what the end of the year totals turned out to be for each of these funds that we use and that are important, but they don't satisfy that mathematical test to be considered a major special revenue fund. And here you can see that almost all of our fund equity is restricted, as we've been discussing. Other than that first column, in the contingent fund, we say that it's assigned, and the reason we say that it's assigned is if there's a legal restriction on the use of that money, I don't know what it is. And just to tell you the history, that's been there for long as any of us have been around. And occasionally, we've added just a little bit of funding to it in the form of a little slice of our mill levy being allocated to it. I think we did that 2 years ago, actually. And so it's discretionary. In other words, the money that went in there was discretionary based on what we approved in our budgets to allocate a little bit of money to that fund.
How do you use it?
I think that is a to be defined by all of you, our governing
So
board.
it's,
So
it's
I-
like a reserve
it's
that's broad, or does it only apply to these 5 categories?
No, it's kind of like a reserve. Kind of like a reserve. I guess it's not
Have you
kind
been
of like
carrying
a.
that, is that year to year the same number or what?
Well, it changes slightly from year to year, but most years it's pretty static unless we've decided to add something
Does it
to
have
it.
to be replenished every year, or is it automatically replenished because it's 3% of some mill levy? or
No,
whatever?
it is
That's
not.
like a reserve I wasn't aware of. I mean, is that carried over that way?
It's carried over. So if we look on this page 33 at the end of 2019, it had equity, we've identified as assigned, but nonetheless, it had fund balance of $118,334.
So
Now that's cash
we could put
held
a
in the
road
treasurer's
bridge
office.
to buy some asphalt, or we could do, hire a COVID coordinator.
As far as I'm aware, the answer to that is yes. Since the money that we put in there was not restricted,
Right.
then the consumption of those funds should be subject to your good judgment.
Okay. Good to know.
If we have any.
Yeah. We're assuming.
Of course, we have some.
Good. We have a lot more since you're here, by the way.
And in these special revenue funds, by their nature, since we're using that money for specific purposes, it's not technically, it's either restricted, not spendable, or assigned. So we rarely have any residual that's considered unassigned.
Can you hear him, Jack, or Don? Okay.
All of
Do we need to get him closer to the mic? Okay, good.
Okay. Well, I can talk a lot louder if we need to, so just let me know.
I thought you was gonna say you could make it more fun. That'd be a challenge,
Oh, I
wouldn't
can
it?
do that too. Let me think about that.
You made it already fun by telling me what the 118 grand is.
Yeah, I wanted to, now that's been there every year, so I don't, when we've reviewed this in the past, maybe we didn't focus on it enough to understand, but it's been used as just that, just a reserve, and I do not recall a time where we've actually used any of that money. We've just kind of let it sit.
Yeah, we try to keep something in the general fund. Yeah.
So I have a question. Speaking of COVID, so we're in the midst of and have been receiving grants related to this COVID thing. Obviously, we're in 2020. Where would that show up on our audit, all that revenue? Would it be restricted?
It will be restricted. The revenue itself will show up in the general fund. It's restricted, though, only in the sense that we use it for defined purposes.
Right, okay.
So it's kind of like most other grant funds. If we simply use the money for its designated purpose, that releases the restriction. So what you would see in the audit report, let's say at the end of 2020,
Right.
would really only be any amount that we had not yet consumed at that point.
Okay.
Would show up as an element of our temporarily restricted fund balance.
Thank you.
Answer your
Yes,
question?
yes.
Okay, we skipped around just a little bit, so I'll try to get
No
us back
problem.
on track, and I'll try to hit some of the fun stuff here pretty soon too. So back on page 5.
Waiting with bated breath.
Yeah, back on page 5. We kind of explain in general terms all the fund equity, kind of what that means. Well, let's just focus a little bit on the changes, if we will, and that requires a little bit of flipping back and forth between pages 7 and 5. So let's just look at the general fund. Our total fund balance at the end of the year was $2,084,428. If we look on page 7, we can see a summary of the revenues. This year, $4,452,070. And so for frame of reference, even though these aren't comparative, I did make a few notes. So our total revenue is higher than 2018 by 607,911. About half of that increase is in taxes. That was 294,322. Some additional grant funding, some increases in licenses and permits, and you'll see in that one total other income, 242,000. That's a little higher than usual because it includes investment income as well as any proceeds from property sales, insurance reimbursements, and so on. So we did have some property that we sold last year, so that's a little higher than it would normally be because of that. The tax revenue turned out to be probably a little higher than what you would remember if you went back to your internal December financial statements, because we're picking up tax revenues that relate to 2019, but you didn't actually collect until January and February of 2020. So for instance, think of the how it works with the sales tax. So local people would here in Custer County would report their sales tax for December to the state of Colorado. Those reports are due in January. And then the state sends our share of that, the county share, back to us in the following month.
Right.
So it's actually always going to be 2 months in arrears. So we end up picking up some revenue that you might not.
So you don't go back and apply that to the last month of 2019?
We do.
It shows up there?
We do. You just don't. You just didn't have it in your internal statements until the
January
year-end
or
adjustments that we give to Donna are posted. Expenditures actually were fairly similar, about 50,000 more than last year. Excess is 559,661. Excess is revenue over expenditures. We had outgoing transfers of 112,601. So we had a positive change in our fund balance of $447.60. And we can kind of see how this works throughout the other funds. So Road and Bridge similarly had $1,972,000. Its revenues exceeded its current spending by $229,154. So once again, an increase in its fund equity. Human Services Fund went the other way a little bit. Our revenue did increase. It was $515,000 last year and $569,000 this year. But our spending was higher. $640,000 is about $100,000 more than our expenditures were in 2018. There's some of those support programs that we consumed more funding than we did before, and we had increases in several other categories. So that caused us to spend more than our current revenue. So we actually had a reduction in our fund equity of $71,172, which, as you can see by that very last line, resulted in a deficit fund position of $2,540. So in the footnotes to the financial statements, we have a little compliance disclosure because state law says we're not supposed to have deficit fund positions in any fund. So that will have to be restored in 2020.
And where does that come from?
Well, there's about two choices. One is in 2020 we spend less than our current revenue
to make up.
And if that's not possible, then we're looking at some other unrestricted resource, and as we're finding out when we look at all this fund structure, pretty much all of that's in the general fund.
Right. So we could transfer to make up that
We could
deficit.
transfer to make up that shortfall if we don't think that we can do it through a
gonna say,
normal budget
Pref-
cycle.
Prefer less spending.
Well, if possible, you know. If possible.
And I just, a comment real quick, I just get the sense, especially on Human Services Fund, because a lot of that is revenue streams other than our general fund is almost out of our control.
It is a little bit, because as you know, obviously, state law requires that we have such a fund and administer those programs. But we don't get all the funding from the state.
Right.
So, at best, it's an 80-20 split, and some of it turns out to be less. And then we have federal funding, and unfortunately, sometimes the federal funding doesn't cover all the program costs. So that one's a little bit of a balancing act. We had this happen, I don't remember how many years ago. It was a similar circumstance, though, and there was a small deficit. And my recollection is we did end up transferring a little bit of money from general fund. So this is pretty small, $2,540.
Right, that's what I was just
I'm hoping
thinking.
we can find a way to
Yeah.
maybe just recover that through.
I wonder if the
2020
Human
operating.
Services Point of Contact Commissioner could just write a check for that $2,540. I mean, that'd be legal, right? I mean, we could accept that.
Always accept.
Could an individual make a donation restricted to this purpose? Yes, they could.
I'm glad to know that. I'll work on that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Then I'm hungry now. I'm hungry now.
That's right.
So, we have to disclose that, when we look at the overall financial report, it's not a big deal, so it's a compliance-related disclosure we're obligated to make, but that's all.
$2,500.
It is not a big deal.
Yeah.
However, because we can't have a negative, we have to handle it, and we will.
Right.
Yeah, I get it.
That's simple. Capital Improvement Fund, of course, you know what all of that's for. Really, almost everything that goes in there is restricted. The primary sources of revenue are an element of the sales tax that was approved by the voters many years ago and restricted to capital improvements or the debt service thereon. And that's why it's okay for us to budget for and pay for these capital lease obligations out of that fund. Of course, the other monies that go in there are generally grant related. That's the $56,000. And you see 32,000 other income. That was insurance proceeds on the sheriff's vehicle that got clobbered last year. And our spending, almost exclusively, because of the nature of the fund, is capital outlay, or, once again, I said the debt service thereon, so that was the capital lease payments paid out of that fund, principal and interest, entitled debt service. The little bit of general government expense at the top, you see 12,104, generally means we had capital expenditures, but they were below that $1,000 capitalization threshold. So that's what that's about. Now, one thing I'll say here, you can see the transfers. I mentioned it when we looked at the general fund. We're outgoing 112,601 from general fund, and 82,601 went into capital improvement fund. The other 30,000 that you see under the other governmental funds column went to EMS. And so that 30,000 was contemplated and included in the budgets that you adopted for 2019. The 82,000 that ended up moving from general fund to capital improvement fund was not contemplated in your original budgets. You did have appropriately authorized fund transfers. So obviously, Treasurer's office won't transfer money between those accounts without commissioner's resolution.
Right.
So obviously that was done, and correctly so. But here's one little sort of, I wouldn't call it a trick. You just have to know when we compare our spending to our adopted budgets, we have to pick up the line that says total expenditures and outgoing transfers. So let's focus on the general fund. If we had expenditures of $3,892,000, then we add to that the money we transferred out. So our total spending for budget purposes is the sum of those two numbers. And the $30,000 that was budgeted for initially was sort of included in that, but the $82,000 that we subsequently decided to and did move to capital improvement fund is included as part of a consumption of the resources, but we didn't amend the general fund budget to increase the appropriated spending level to cover that. So because of that, that's another one of those little compliance related disclosures in the footnotes that it will say that we spent more than our appropriated budget. And if we focused only on the total expenditure line, that would be true, but we have to include any consumption of resources. So the reason that I'm focusing on that is that if we decide to make transfers from one fund to another, and almost all the time it's going to be from general fund to somewhere else, because that's where we have discretionary authority to use those monies. If we do that in the general fund, we, step one, have to authorize the transfer, which we did. And step B is we have to consider whether we need a budget amendment to increase the appropriated budget expenditure levels. Does that make sense to everyone? We have a similar circumstance when we enter into new capital lease agreements. We'll see that under the capital improvement column. So where it says proceeds from capital leases, $116,473, that's really not proceeds, like we got money and then spent it. What that really means is that's the financed portion of the capital lease. But the accounting rules require us to recognize that financed portion, and then the spending side is included in our capital outlay up above. So when we enter into one of these lease agreements, we have to have two things there considered. One is, of course, all of those kinds of obligations are supposed to be approved by our governing board. And then secondly, with the understanding that that finance portion gets included in the expenditures for capital outlay, then if one of these occurs during the year that wasn't contemplated in our initial budgeting, then we probably have to do a budget amendment to increase our appropriated spending levels. So we had a couple of those things happen this year, which causes us to have disclosures in our footnotes that said we may have overspent our budget. We use soft language that says we may have, but really we did. And so
is this a reflection on management decisions?
no, I don't think so. I think it's why I wanted to go into a little bit of detail here is that understanding that it's kind of a two-part, and when we handled the first step just as we should have. So all these lease agreements were approved. I could see where we had them approved in our minutes, which is fine. And all the funds transfers were appropriately approved. So there were no movements of money in the treasurer's office that weren't because of an appropriate order from our Board of Commissioners. So that part is right. We just have to have the step B is after the transfer, if it caused a particular fund to consume more resources, either because it was an outgoing transfer or that we subsequently spent the money in the fund that received those funds, then we have to consider, should it be coupled with a budget amendment to increase our spending authority? That's the only thing.
So if I may, the proceeds from capital leases, 116,000, is that in the capital outlay? I'm just talking about
Yes,
capital
sir, it
improvement.
is.
So
It's included in that
okay.
total.
180?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, makes sense to everyone? So that's an easy fix. That's a whole lot different than a case where we clearly have, and we haven't had that here, so thankfully I've never had to talk to you all about that, but I have had some of those experiences in my career where the spending was just out of control. It was simply beyond the resources available to that government, and unfortunately, it got some of them in trouble. So, if we had that circumstance, just so you know, if we had that circumstance where it was, in my opinion, that our financial position had deteriorated because of that, then I would consider a modification in that opinion letter.
Right.
So it would look a little different, and those aren't pleasant things to do.
Right.
So no,
Our job is to keep
this is
the
a
habits.
housekeeping matter more than anything else here.
Right. Internal processes.
Yes, that's all. Okay, questions on that stuff? I'm just gonna go kind of quickly. Pages 9, 10, and 11 deal with what we call an internal service fund, and so in plain language, for our purposes here, that means our insurance fund. The reason we include that in this section, as opposed to a special revenue fund, is because, well, plainly, GAAP requires it. So if we have a fund created to collect resources from the other funds, in this case that's what we do, and then we pay out insurance premiums for the most part, it's an internal service fund. So this is merely a balance sheet of the cash and receivables that it had, doesn't have much in payables, and it's equity. The revenue and
Not much is an understatement.
right. Revenues and expenses are on page 10. And internal service funds are required to have a cash flow statement. So that's what page 11 is. Page 12, statement of fiduciary net position. So, and then you'll see under the head of the column that says agency funds. Really what this is at December 31st, the cash held in the treasurer's office that has to be remitted to other agencies. Okay, so you know all the collections going into the treasurer's offices for all the taxing areas in the county. And so some of that, of course, comes to the county government. Some of it goes to other governments. So this is what was held at the end of 2019. Then we start the page 13 is the notes to the financial statements. And they continue and don't conclude until page 28. So I'll just tell you that most people don't think this is the most fun part of this report. So, but that's not that it doesn't have some importance. But I intend to point out just a couple things. When we get beyond most of what Note 1 is, which deals with accounting and financial reporting protocol for the most part. So it is important, but on the other hand, it doesn't change a whole lot sometimes from year to year. So disclosures are very similar to last year. And that's pretty much true for all of Note 1, which doesn't conclude until the top of page 18. And in Note 2, this is where we address the stewardship, compliance, and accountability. So these couple of compliance-related things that I've mentioned to you, in subsection, paragraph, whatever you want to call it, B, where it says expenditures in excess of budget amounts. And then we've listed each of the funds for which this condition was true. General fund, human services, capital improvement, and tourism. Their actual spending, their budgeted spending, but we included in the budget any additional supplements if you had them, and then the corresponding excess. Simply just says this may be a violation of Colorado local budget law. My expectation is one of two things. State Auditor's Office may send a letter and say, hey, you're not supposed to do that. And we'll say, we know, and we fixed it. And that's pretty much it. And they may not send you anything at all. So if there is an inquiry, it should be a very simple explanatory response is all that would be needed. Same on that paragraph D at the bottom. We talked about the deficit equity position in the human services fund. So I doubt, honestly, there'll be any inquiry, but if there is, that would probably be how we would deal with it. Page 19 is a summary of the cash and investments, and we really only have a couple things that falls into the definition of investments. Occasionally we have certificates of deposit. We do have a collar trust account with a lot of money in it. So those two things, the disclosures, the nature of the disclosures, and the requirements under the statute have not changed from last year to this. In note 5, at the bottom of page 20, we give a brief explanation. We say due to / from other funds. We don't have any of that outstanding at the end of the year, so that's a good thing in my view. We once did, but now we're doing a better job of keeping that tidied up. And then transfers. It describes at the bottom of that page, but then summarized in a brief table at the top of the next page. That's just the transfers we spoke of a little bit ago. Capital assets is a change in our capital asset activity, so land, building, equipment, infrastructure spending, and the related accumulated depreciation. We add stuff we bought, we took stuff away that we sold or that was destroyed, and end up with an ending balance. Once again, this is based on our historical cost. So that's whatever we paid for some of these things at the time they were acquired or constructed. There's a few things over the years that have been donated, but they have a nominal value, but not adjusted to market values. One thing you might be interested to know at the bottom of that page, in the governmental fund financial statements where we recognize these assets and depreciation, we also recognize the expense. And that number that we talked about, that you asked about, the increase in our equity there was 800,000 plus, is after an element of depreciation of almost 500,000, 497,656. Page 23, note 10 starts about in the middle of that page and concludes on the next page, I believe. And that's a little synopsis of the changes in our long-term liabilities. The only long-term liabilities we presently have, as we've been discussing, is capital lease obligations. That's been true as long as I have been working with the county. We've never had any bonded debt or any other long-term obligations. And of course, you know, capital leases is a common way that we are allowed to finance asset acquisitions and not violate the multi-year debt rule under the Tabor law. Compensated absence, other obligations there is really dealing only with the landfill. landfill disclosures are on page 12, note 12 rather, page 25 and 26. Page 26 is a narrative explanation of these fund balance categories, but if we want to see the totals in a table form, that's at the top of page 27. And it's sorted out by each fund, although the smaller special revenue funds are all included together in the other governmental totals. Page 28 finally concludes the footnotes, and we added note 16, subsequent event. We have added this to every report that we have completed since March, and simply says that the WHO has declared this COVID-19 a pandemic, and the language being suggested by AICPA and other authorities is, well, we expect this to be temporary. There's considerable uncertainty around the duration, and because of that, we have economic uncertainties, and we don't really know what they're going to be at this point, frankly. So, it's a very generic disclosure, but we felt necessary in the circumstances. So pages 29, 30, 31, and 32 are all revenue and expenditure reports for the general fund and the major special revenue funds compared to their budget. So if we focus on page 29, just as an example, we have, just going through the columns, budgeted amounts. We have original, final, actual, and then a variance. So you can see here where we have original budgets and final, that the numbers are the same, really just means that we didn't adopt a budget amendment for that fund at some point during the year. If we did, then the original amounts would be adjusted for whatever that modification may have been to get our final numbers, and then the final numbers would be compared to actual. So, pretty much that simple. So I made the statement and pointed out to you that general fund was one of those where our actual spending was more than our appropriated amounts. So once again, if we focus on the total expenditures line, you can see our budget was $3,896,793. We spent $3,892,000. Actually, it's a little less. So why did I say that? Because of this transfer circumstance that I described to you, where we budgeted for the $30,000 that went to EMS, and even though we properly approved the transfer of the money to capital improvement for the $82,000, what we could have done, probably should have done at that point, is coupled the authorization of that transfer with an amendment to the budget to increase the transfer line item, and then that would have eliminated that condition. Okay? That makes sense, hopefully?
So where did the $677,462 go? That's like, to me, something we didn't spend, right?
Well, no, I guess it didn't really go anywhere, because it's merely a representation of the variance from the budget amount.
Right, so we budgeted the X,
So
we didn't spend that much.
So to focus on what we did, we'd look at the actual column. Not the variance column, the actual column.
Right, so that's.
The actual column is we got 673,000 more revenue than our budget.
Right.
But the 673,000 isn't necessarily all unused. In our case, it actually is, because we didn't use it. But let's just focus on that for a minute. It's a good question and a way to look at it. To understand what happened to the money, we have to focus on the actual column. So we got $4,452,000, or at least we recognize that much revenue, with the understanding some of it didn't actually get here until the early part of 2020. And then we spent $3,892,000, we transferred out 112,601. So we actually increased our equity by the 447,060.
So is that equity or actual cash?
Well, in our case, it's cash.
Right, so it's, to me, it's like another reserve.
It's cash, and it increased our reserve.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
it did.
so that's like another, we can, and that's in the general fund?
That's
And
in the general
so
fund.
we can use that on any other thing we want?
For
No, I'm
almost,
just-
almost.
That we can.
Yeah, almost. Just subject to, the discussion about some slice of that money is sometimes from restricted
Yes,
resources. And so we have to use it for those restricted
Right.
purposes. But beyond that,
Could be a
yes,
road
it
bridge.
is subject
We
to
got
your
maybe some
good
extra money.
judgment.
Okay.
Mhm.
Bonuses for commissioner.
All right, yeah, that to me is key.
Just thought I'd throw it out.
That's good to know, so that's another.
It's an example, I guess.
Statutorily, you can't.
I know
Be
that.
fun of
Good or bad?
I would have a different report to give you.
Statutorily, you can't. There's people listening. It was a joke.
I know that. So yes. Now in this page here, we're dealing with just the total change in the fund equity,
Right.
but understand that some of that change could be from restricted resources.
Sure, and you'd have to confine it to that fund line to use it in that fund for whatever it's
Right.
legally. to be
Whatever,
able to use
whatever
it.
that's for.
Sure.
Exactly. But actually, there's not, the majority of the fund equity in the general fund is not restricted. It is unrestricted,
See, Sam, to me.
unassigned, available for your use.
Right. To me, taxpayer money that's raised for things, and I think it's a crime not to spend it all for what they think they're paying it for, except for what you must carry by law as a reserve or whatever. So how do we see that as we go along without waiting for you to say, by the end of the year here, we got $500,000 we could spend on something?
Well,
Carry it over to the next year and do it? or-
you carry it over to the next year, and you have to understand that the cash flow doesn't always equate to these totals.
Right.
So that's why,
So you gotta be able to cover the checks and
right.
the cash flow. I
So
understand.
if we had the, let's just say that we only carried over not one penny more than the legally restricted amounts, then I would suggest to you that before we got too far into the next year, we would have difficulty
You could cover
paying our
checks,
bills.
and revenue isn't there to cover it. Yeah.
Because we have to remember that when we're looking at these numbers, they're annual totals.
Right.
But the money doesn't come in
Right,
equal
right.
1/12 slices.
Right.
It'd be nice if it did. So we always have to look from a perspective, is our working capital position adequate to cover those adjustments to the cash flow, and sometimes they're with a high degree of uncertainty. For
Right.
example, property taxes are pretty good as long as people pay the property taxes.
This year's gonna be tougher.
Yeah, but sales tax, for example, and other kinds of use or consumption-related taxes aren't so easy to predict. So,
Good.
but
It doesn't mean we can't afford it, it just means we may not have the money available at the time.
You need it correct.
So, page 30 is road and bridge, same sort of presentation. Page 31 is human services. Page 32 is capital improvements. So the reason that these are in that section is GAP requires this information is what we consider required supplementary information. So in our report that we didn't focus on every bit of the language, we deal with that differently than we do the matters that are just beyond that in other supplementary information. And we made reference to this a bit ago, because this is where we find the details of the funds that are special revenue funds but didn't satisfy that mathematical test to be considered major. So we see the 5 funds that applies to there. The balance sheet's on page 33, revenue and expenditures on page 34. And then for those smaller funds, we're required under state law to include in our report a comparison of the budget amounts to the actual amounts. And so we'll see that for each of those funds starting on page 35. 36 is CTF, 37 is EMS, 38 is the airport, 39 is lodging and tourism, and 40 is the insurance fund, which I pointed out to you earlier is treated as an internal service fund. And E911 authority, where, as you are aware, that entity was created by intergovernmental agreement many years ago. The accounting standards require that the county include its activity in our annual report. So it appears in 3 places. One is the statement of net position way in the front, the statement of activities that followed that, and then it similarly adopts a budget. So we have to do a comparison schedule showing its relationship of actual revenues and expenditures to its budget. And then the last thing that will appear in the bound report, it's a prescribed form by the state of Colorado, and we have to report the revenue, receipts, and consumption of monies in road and bridge, essentially. It's this local highway finance report. And actually, Donna prepares this and sends it in. And then what we're required to do is if we've made any adjustments to that road and bridge fund, and we always do, then we have to take her original report and show the revisions on here. So that's the purpose of that report. It's at the tail end. And because we have a year that we're not subject to the single audit rules I mentioned before, then that concludes the report.
So on the highway report, if we had an interstate going through our county, then I'm assuming our receipts from the federal government would be significantly more than they are here. Would that be a fair statement, or?
Well, it could be.
The other way of asking that, why isn't the receipts from the federal government substantial for highways? Is that a gas tax from the highway, federal level?
For most of what that is, yes.
Okay.
It's excise tax that's actually funneled back from the most part, from the federal to the state government and then to local government. So I can't tell you. That's one question I cannot answer, is what that funding formula is. I don't know what that is.
Okay. Wow. Questions for Mr. Sam?
Very comprehensive again, thank you. I didn't have a chance to read your, I'm going to call it executive summary for lack of another term, the text. Did anything jump out at you that we have done that we've been deficient on, or is there significant improvement items we need? How can we make this even better for next year?
Good question. If you look through this report, and if you went back a year or two, you would see that some of the subject matter is pretty much the same. And some things we've done a pretty good job of kind of cleaning up. So I don't know if you recall. I'm sorry, but this is bugging me a little.
I'm not freaking out.
From a couple years ago where we had cash in places where we didn't think it was appropriate, and it pretty much got all that cleaned up. So that's a big improvement. Places where we tend to struggle a little bit more, and I would like to see us maybe focus on trying to improve. One of those is E911. So I know it seems like it's a little outside the scope of what we do here, but as you can see, it has to be included in our reports. And in our observation here, we say accounting functions should be done throughout the year, deposits made regularly, and so on. We pretty much state the obvious. County should consider implementing oversight procedures to ensure this is done. Current status, no improvement. Okay, so let me make that as plain as I can. That's to describe it in the way that I did there is tactful, but I'm not sure that it conveys the fact that really our accounting in that area has been deficient, and it needs to be improved.
And so I think we're aware of that. Obviously, it's kind of a touchy situation, but I'm assuming because we do have to account for that in our audit, then that kind of gives us the authority to say, you got to make some changes here. Is that within our purview?
Well, it has a separate board, but I do think that it is, because we have the ultimate reporting responsibility. So, absolutely.
So Commissioner Kanda is the co-chair of the E911 board. This has been a source of frustration since I've been a commissioner anyway. So how do we fix that?
Well, I suppose there's any number of options.
Let me restate that. Would it be out of the realm to say we want you to meet with our auditor and we need you to figure out a way to fix these issues?
That would be one approach.
What was the deficit on that reserve? It's required to be 216, 800. So.
On the Tabor reserve?
That's the requirement.
There is no deficit there.
So.
There is no deficit.
So what's the reserve that we're carrying that makes this an issue?
Is it an issue?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no. No, I'm sorry. In that, so let's just talk about the structure. The items that we've reported to you in previous years, I kind of repeat.
Okay.
And then I go, current status, we've improved, or sometimes we haven't improved, as the case may be.
Right.
There's 6 of those. And then skipping ahead to where you are, we get beyond that 6th item, and we see, in addition to the topics described above, we offer comments, recommendations for your consideration. So that first one there is where I describe the Tabor Reserve. There is no deficiency. If there was, I'd have to tell you about it. This is merely a reminder that that's our reserve requirement at this point in time. That's all. And the same is pretty much true the rest of the things that are in that section. But focusing on the original question sort of posed to me is which things I think are in need of the most improvement. Well, E911 would be one. And item 6 on that 3rd page deals with grant accounting. And here I say current status. I'm kind of being tough on you. It says regressed. Grant documentation.
I'm lost, sir.
Okay.
You're still in the
I'm on this separate letter.
unattached. I was on the wrong number 6, sorry.
On the page 3.
Third,
But
fourth page.
the pages are at the top. Page numbering's at the top.
Got it.
Page 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see it
And
now.
then number 6. And it deals with grant-related activity. Starts with the sentence, it is extremely important to maintain records and so on. Okay, so dispense with that.
So
verbiage.
the grant you're speaking of there under current status, did we get that resolved?
No.
Or not?
No,
Okay. Not in 2019.
not in 2019.
Are you aware, did we get that resolved in 2020?
Don't know.
Okay.
Don't know that for certain.
Okay.
So, we have protocol. We could see where the money came from and what we'd spent it. But we had one particular grant that we requested grant documentation, including the grant document itself. Yeah, it doesn't say there, but I can tell you it's what we refer to as a READY grant. And we did get some information about 2020, but not 2019. So without, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a great big amount of money. Yeah, it wasn't a great big
But
amount
it's
of
still
money.
a hole in the process somewhere.
We have a protocol where, or at least I thought we did, where all these grant documents were to be archived with the
Yes.
county clerk's office. But this one wasn't there. And repeated requests were not successfully responded to. Let's just put it that way. So, this is more of an observation of the, not that the amount of money was so great in this particular case that it was that troublesome. It's the fact that
It was a trouble.
it's a process.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, this one escaped that protocol, and there could be cases where, something of more substance, I suppose.
Exactly. I mean,
But from our perspective, you realize what I have to look at in these grants is we're looking at the grant document to see what language is included to describe to us what the grant is for specifically, what we are allowed to spend the money on, if we've spent some of the money, then to verify by sampling those expenditures and the corresponding documentation that they've followed those rules, and whether or not we have any accrued or deferred revenue resulting from that grant activity. So what I mean by that is many of these grants are what we call expenditure driven. We get a grant award, we usually have a budget or some similar type of reporting that was required to secure that grant. We have reporting obligations back to the granting agency. And we have to spend the money and then typically request reimbursement. So if we had valid expending against that grant that we had not yet been reimbursed for, we would recognize a receivable. But without the ability to look at all that data, I can't tell you how much that was. Now, if this was a $400,000 grant and not a $40,000 grant, then this was something we probably couldn't have completed this report without,
Right.
insisting on that data. This was relatively small. So what I'd like for us to focus on is how do we ensure that all of this activity is
Right.
going to be identified and archived properly
Exactly.
so that they can be retrieved when it's necessary.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think we believed we had that system in place. But it doesn't seem to be the case here. So certainly we need to tighten that whole process up a little bit.
When I say there under current status regress, that doesn't apply to all of our grant accounting, because as you know, we have different people in different departments that manage some of these, and some of them did an outstanding job. And ones that, maybe less than perfect, I can say, without exception, other than this one grant we're talking about, were responsive to our inquiries. So all that I'm
Right.
was pleased about, but
Yeah,
I'm
we
concerned
tried,
about why we had this one that sort of escaped the protocol.
Right. Yeah, so we had these communications, I'm looking at one here from Andrew about that READY grant. To this day, I can't tell you why we could not get our hands on that information for you. I think we've got kind of an internal problem of, we assumed economic development was taking care of everything. They assumed we had all the documentation, the archival material for that, and I don't think those two assumptions were accurate. But that's internal. something that we need to deal with, so.
Yeah, I mean, now that this is made brought to light, I mean, we're gonna work on it. Hopefully next year, when you sit here, I'll be in the Bahamas having a pina colada. I mean,
You'll be a big help.
hopefully next
Can I
time
ask
you
a
sit
simple
here,
question?
There you go.
you'll say, great improvement.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
I just want to step through a little bit. I see the fuel sales, and I know why that's better now. They are accounting for a lot better, and we have a better system to account for the sales. That's improved. I was glad to see that. The money collect on number 2 by it stated, or our officials need to be logged within 30 days. Is that a significant problem? Are people not getting it accounted for?
You know
What
what?
can we do to fix it?
Yeah, it's, I don't think this is one that's particularly difficult to resolve.
So was that an
Mostly, we're
exchange-
talking
extension
about,
office issue, or-
no, well, we cite extension office there, but really probably assessor's office too. And they don't collect very much money in there, actually. And so
So then that's it,
periodically, it does
then, yeah, I
get
guess I better
transferred
go.
over to the treasurer, just like it's supposed to, and it always gets there. But technically, the statute says monies collected in these different sites
Get it
are
in
to be
there.
turned over within 30 days.
It's not hard to do.
And so some of it, I presume because it's really not very much money in most cases, is beyond 30 days.
Yeah.
So, the,
Okay.
where this particular one originated, that we spent some time on a couple of years ago, is where we had monies being collected and significant, I thought, comparatively significant accounts held outside the treasurer's office. And, you know, the sheriff's office was one of those. All of those now are compliant.
Good.
So I'm happy that we rectified that.
Okay. The E911, we sort of just went blowing by it, but that's always been an issue. It's a volunteer function.
No, we pay her.
No, that's right, we pay her, but it's helter-skelter. That we can go and try to adjust and fix. Was that significant because of past years? I know we've talked about it, it's just not being corrected.
E911, well, I think we had the same observation the year prior, but we didn't see any improvement.
Okay,
So.
that's good. The human resources we've talked about.
Yes.
And so that's, then you have the number 5, recording expenditures should be correct and consistent throughout the year. So where is this?
Okay, so here's where I think we're pretty close to being able to get rid of this one.
Says no change.
It says no change, but let me tell you where that debt service, as you know, really the only debt service expenditures we have for the capital lease agreement. And if you notice in the report here, all of those are sorted out into categories called debt service, principal, or interest. But when we record those in our funds that pay those amounts, mostly either road and bridge or capital improvement funds, they're not always going into those accounts. Sometimes they're in an account called contracts or something else. So we'd like to see some consistency there. But what I am able to do is, now that, you know, since I know where they're going, they're easy to find. So that part's really mostly resolved. Capital outlay is a little trickier, and the reason I think that it is because of this capitalization threshold that I think I mentioned or someone asked about, this $1,000 threshold. So we have to keep that in mind. If it's something we buy, we kind of think of as a capital purchase, but it's below that threshold, then it should go into a different account, because that capital outlay, and I understand people like me only have to deal with these mechanics, but the things that are in those fund statements identified as capital outlay, when I transition to the government-wide statements, it has to zero out. And I can't leave anything in there that doesn't satisfy, bless you, the capitalization threshold. Does that make sense? So it's merely a case of being a little more careful or cognizant of that threshold and categorizing those expenditures. Now, it can be a little more difficult when we're talking about a combination of expenditures to, for example, to construct something. we may have individual expenditures that are well below the $1,000 threshold, but when we look at that construction project collectively, it'll obviously be over that. In that case, then we're gonna combine all those costs, even though we may have individual purchases below that threshold. So I think it's a matter of just kind of keeping those rules in mind and understanding, how to differentiate.
Then, let me finish up. Number 6 on the page now, maintaining records for grants. I think we've had a lot of different people working the grants and the process. I think we're going to have some help doing that. We get some additional help that Donna will have to help maintain some of the grant stuff. So that's pretty good to look at. We talked about the Tabor Reserve. We got to make sure that's in there for you, 911. The 4 funds, we've talked about that too. In the county, you mentioned landfill separate. Why did you think that would be necessary? It's pretty easy for us to see.
Yeah,
What's the problem?
I don't think there is a problem. The only reason I even put that in there is that if you look at reports from other counties or visit with some of your colleagues, some of those entities do account for landfills in a separate, it would be what we call a proprietary fund. And that's where all the revenue that is generated and all the expenditures are reflected. But it would include long-term assets and liabilities.
We see sort of that, but maybe it's the way it's reported to you.
No, what we're doing isn't wrong. You're allowed to leave it there in the general fund. It has a separate department. What we don't have in there, though, that you don't see until you transition to the government-wide is the long-term obligation for the closure and post-closure costs.
Oh, so you have to
Right.
sort that out.
So, some entities, I presume, have wanted to see all of that together and apart from the general fund. And the reason that I put that in there is just so you would be aware that that is a possibility. I'm not sure, well, let me be clear, I'm not saying I necessarily am suggesting you should do that, but you could weigh the relative pros and cons at some point.
In the documentation, do we not do that on number 4 there?
Yeah, we kind of do. I'd like for us to maybe be a little more formal about it, but we update this depreciation number we've been talking about in fixed assets. We have software where that's compiled, and we usually remember to give Donna a list of that after we're done at the end of the year. We'd like for, as you can envision, we have assets that are all over the place in the county, so we would like for people working in some of those departments to help identify when we have changes that we might not otherwise know about. So if we buy something, okay, we know what we bought. If we sell something, same thing. So what we're really looking at is just updating it for things that might have got moved for some other reason. We transfer it to a different location, or it's simply something taken out of service because you can't use it anymore.
So the way we fix that is Donna can write a note to the departments.
Just have them
track it
review
and
that,
say-
and then
just
if
remind
there,
them.
right, and then if there are changes, then we can use that information to update that.
And the other one that kind of bothered me is the 2003 debt, whatever that was. Why is that still an issue?
Don't know, don't have an answer. Been outstanding for 17 years,
We talked
almost.
about it last
Do you
year.
know anything about it, Donna?
I can't speak to human services.
Why haven't we been banged for it from somebody at state? I've heard about this. It's like it's a loan course
It kind of is.
for 17 years.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is, and the state's been informed,
And then they don't want to.
but they've never done anything about it. So,
That's strange.
Yeah, it's really weird.
It's what,
And I've heard
27
I've
years it's
heard,
been sitting there, and we don't know what to do.
Right.
with it.
And
17
I've heard
years.
Laura bring it up before, but hey, they're not wanting it, so what do I
So-
think about it?
so we just kind of leave it there because we don't really have authority to say, well, it's not a liability
It'd be
anymore.
nice if they don't want it, tell us you don't want it and we'll
But
use it.
just so you know, that's sitting in our liability section.
Can we quantify what the liability is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
27,000.
That,
No,
the,
no, not the amount. To
Identify
whom
what
the liability.
Oh, yeah, what,
She hasn't been able to do that.
oh, no, it's payable back to the state.
Right.
yeah, but who there would say, I want it or I don't want it? Who can give
Oh,
us the
that
release on that
specific
liability?
individual,
Or that department?
I don't know who that
'Cause,
individual
we'd like to
would be.
get it off the books. It seems to me there ought to be a what is it, a 7-year, let's let it expire and now it's
Yeah,
ours.
let's-
Too bad you can't get it from us.
Well,
Would we be out of line if we zeroed it out and did that? And then later on, if they decide to find it, then we'd have to deal with $27,000.
we have two elements there. The second one isn't identified here. We have one amount that goes back to 2017. It's about 20,000 or so.
Really? So there's 40,000 hanging out there. That
Mhm.
we're
That 20,000, so, you know, the money that comes from the state for that purpose is partially federal funds.
probably
It is,
Pass-through.
not probably, it is. And so it's subject to the single audit testing, compliance-related testing. So in 2017, as a part of that, we discovered an error, and that error resulted in, actually, we got too much money by about $20,000. Now, 2017 did not require these single audit reports because we were below the 750,000 level.
so it didn't get flagged back to them.
It's exactly right. Now, in those reports, if we had that condition relating to federal funds, we included in a section that's called findings and question costs. And that, I suppose, makes it easier for them to identify. And most of the time, findings and question costs means we didn't use the money properly or something like that. And the federal government perceives that as you owe it back to them. But there was no single audit reports because of that. So, but the communication did take place, we understand, between our staff here and the state to explain how much of that was. It was included in our audit report for that year, but the state just simply haven't taken any action to resolve it. So, that one's more recent. The one that goes back to 2003, I'm inclined to say that maybe we clear that one off the books, and if somebody asks about it, well,
Or
I guess,
we
okay.
could write a letter and say to the state treasurer and say.
But
"Here's
the
something
20,000
that goes
or
this far
so,
back."
yeah, the
Or taken.
20,000 that relates to 2017, I don't know why they haven't taken any action to recover that. And usually what they have done it in the past. We have had occasions where they've done that, and usually what they do is they just withdraw it out of your authorized funding. And so subtract it from current funding.
Seems to me we could balance the deficit and the needs of the human resources.
Well, you might. If you took the old 2003 amount and moved it from a liability to equity, that would pretty much solve that problem.
Right.
So I've got a couple questions for you.
Yes, sir.
And one is totally ignorance on my part. On the unattached letter, I think the first time I see this is in page 2, number 4, CFMS activity. If I walked out of here and somebody asked me what that was, I wouldn't be able to tell them. That acronym, is that a software accounting?
Yeah, that's the system that the state uses to disseminate benefits, both in revenue and the corresponding costs for services provided through that department. So that's people that qualify for any number of different programs. And so we get, based on the people that we're serving, we get credited with funds from the state. And of course, we get those taken away as we consume those resources for their purpose.
Thank you. And my second question is, What is the difference? I'll try to explain my question a little more after I ask it. The difference between the draft and the final that we're gonna get. If we had issues today, then you would go back and work those, or if we said, no, we don't agree, this is, I mean, are there typically changes between the draft and the final? And if not, is it just a process we go through the draft?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because we're not
and
signing this, we're not approving this.
That's a good question, and here's basically, if there was some element of this report that was incomplete, I would tell you that, obviously, because that would mean we couldn't finalize it until it became complete.
What makes it final?
But what makes it final is your opportunity to have gone through this process today, get your questions answered, if you have them. And this is basically the theory of this. The financial statements belong to the county. They're not mine. The only thing that belongs to me technically is the opinion letter at the front, pages 1 and 2. So I present them to you stamped draft until you've had a chance to look at it, ask your questions if you've got them, and once we're done with that, then we proceed to finalize it.
So
At this point, there will be no change
that's what I was
from
saying. It's like
this
you're just gonna
document.
rotate
I'm
draft
not,
off.
I'm not asking you to review or approve something that's gonna change in any way once I read. So,
Okay, thank you. All right, other questions for Mr. DiNardo? I'm gonna have to go back and unmute the phones because we have to take public comment on this as well. That's why my phone rang. It was our IT guy wanting to know when I wanted to do that, so bear with me just a second. I have no idea.
All right, I'd like to have them hired. Obviously, be good bookkeepers.
Vern, are you still on?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
we can unmute the phones, thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Anybody on, Vern?
Oh, there's nobody else on.
Okay, thank you. So,
Are you adjourned?
no, we are not. We're
Okay.
finishing up the last item of business, then we'll move into public comment.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's nobody on except for my phone and your phone.
Okay, thank you. Questions or comments for Mr. Sam? Thank you. I assume the clerk is buying lunch today for you, Sam. I don't know that, or maybe it's finance department. We just haven't decided. So I can tell you who's not, but I can't tell you who is.
understand.
That front set up.
Maybe you're buying lunch for you. I don't know that, but thank you very much. We appreciate that. Turnaround time on the final. We'll need to put that on in a subsequent agenda, which I'm sure Donna will let us know that, huh?
Yeah, it just, at this point, once you have approved, then we will do final reports, bound reports, and then file a copy with the state auditor's office.
So do we need a motion to adopt the draft?
You may do that. If you're
There's
ready
no
to,
signature
you
page,
may.
but
Yeah,
that would be typical. I can't remember what we did last year, so.
if you're ready to do that, then that would be my authorization to finalize the report and file it with the state auditor's office.
Quick
That's
question.
up to you.
Donna's the first time she's seen this too.
Uh,
Or have you been
no,
working the input
we
with her
sent
so
her
she's
some
comfortable with it?
data because she reviews the management and discussion analysis piece, that MD&A piece. So she should have had some chance. Obviously, we work with Donna throughout the process.
Right, so you don't have any major issues, right? I don't either, but we can.
Well, it's not on the agenda for
I know,
consideration.
that's what I was
so
gonna say,
we have to
we'd have to consider it somewhere.
So I would suggest we put it
What's it
on the
say?
12th. I'd really like to just kind of run through it a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Great.
I like playing with these numbers.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
And in the meantime, if there are questions that come up or that we didn't cover or something you think of later,
Okay.
I'll be glad to respond to.
So, Ms. Kelly, I'm assuming you're making a note. So I would recommend then that we place this on the mid-month agenda for approval of the draft audit. Okay, sir. Thank you very
Okay.
much. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming up.
Thank you. Good to see all of you.
Absolutely.
Don't be a stranger.
Well, the less we see you, the more we're doing right. I hope.
Just come up and buy us lunch.
Come up and yell at
I
us.
can do that.
Yeah.
You can do that.
All right, Sam. Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it. Okay, any other additional items of business come before the group, gentlemen?
I have none, sir.
Nor do I.
Me either.
Okay. We'll move on then. Is there any public comment? Doesn't sound like my mic is running, but again, public comment. Hearing none, Chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll move to adjourn.
I'll second the motion. It's been moved and seconded to adjourn. All in favor, say aye. Commissioner Flower, aye. Commissioner Kanda,
Aye.
Commissioner Prince. Opposed? Motion carries. Meeting's adjourned.
Is that a 1